Hey guys, tonight we begin a story that changed the world. Picture this, May 19th, 1536. A young woman, barely 33 years old, steps onto a wooden scaffold. She's wearing a grey damask gown, her dark hair tucked beneath a simple headdress. Around her neck, nothing yet. But in a few moments, a French sword will separate her head from her body. Her crime: loving a king who loved her back, until he didn't. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and the man who ordered her death. The same man who tore apart an entire kingdom just to marry her. King Henry VIII. Tonight we're diving into the most dangerous love affair in history. Now, before we step into this tragic tale together, I want to ask you something. If this story grabs you, if you find yourself leaning in, wanting to know what happens next, would you take just a second to hit that like button and subscribe? It really helps me keep these stories coming to you. And hey, I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom? Living room? Maybe you're on a late night drive? Drop a comment and let me know. Also, if you're settling in for the night, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise. Let's make this cozy. All right, let's begin. So here's the question that's haunted historians for nearly 500 years. How does a love story that literally broke the Christian world in half end with a woman's head rolling into a basket of straw? Think about it. Henry VIII didn't just have a crush on Anne Boleyn. This wasn't some medieval Tinder swipe. The man waited 7 years for her. 7 years. He wrote her 17 love letters. Letters so passionate, so desperate that when you read them today, they sound like they were written by a teenager who just discovered what heartbreak feels like. In one letter, preserved in the Vatican Library to this day, Henry wrote, "I would you were in my arms, or I in yours, for I think it is a long time since we kissed." This is a king, mind you, a man who could have anyone, and he's writing like a lovesick puppy. But here's where it gets wild. To marry Anne, Henry didn't just break up with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Oh no, he broke up with the Pope. He severed England from the Roman Catholic Church, a relationship that had existed for over 1,000 years. Imagine the most dramatic breakup text you've ever sent, then multiply it by, I don't know, an entire religious reformation. That's what we're talking about here. Monasteries were destroyed, people were executed, the entire power structure of England was flipped upside down. And for what? For love? For lust? For an heir? Maybe all three. But here's the twist that makes this story so haunting. Just 3 years after Anne became Queen of England, Henry had her arrested, tried, and executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Charges that most historians today agree were completely fabricated. So what happened? How do you go from, "I'll burn the world down for you," to "off with her head" in less time than it takes to get through a presidential term? You know what's crazy? Anne Boleyn's story isn't just about a king and his obsession. It's a masterclass in power, manipulation, ambition, and the terrifying fragility of being a woman in a man's world. It's about what happens when you play a dangerous game and lose. Let me paint you a picture of that final morning. According to eyewitness accounts, and we have several including from the Constable of the Tower of London, Anne woke up early on May 19th. She was calm, eerily calm actually. She'd been imprisoned in the Tower of London for just 19 days. 19 days earlier, she'd been Queen of England, living in luxury, planning state dinners, advising the king on policy. Now, she was waiting to die. Her lady-in-waiting later reported that Anne said, "I heard say the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." Then, according to this account recorded by chronicler Edward Hall, she put her hands around her throat and laughed. Can you imagine that level of composure? Or was it denial? Or maybe it was the only power she had left, the power to control how she faced her end. The execution was set for 9 in the morning, but they delayed it. Why? Because Henry wanted to make sure the sword arrived from France. You see, Henry, in perhaps the only mercy he showed Anne at the end, hired a master swordsman from Calais instead of using the traditional English axe. The sword was faster, cleaner. Some historians think this was guilt. Others think Henry just wanted to look merciful without actually being merciful. Typical Henry, honestly. While Anne waited, do you know what Henry was doing? Playing tennis. No, seriously. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, recorded that on the day of Anne's execution, Henry was playing tennis and flirting with Jane Seymour, the woman who would become his third wife just 11 days later. 11 days, let that sink in. Around 11 o'clock, Anne was finally led out to the scaffold. About 1,000 people gathered to watch. Back then, executions were public spectacles. Entertainment, if you can believe that. Anne wore a red petticoat under her grey gown. Some historians think red symbolised martyrdom. Others think it was just practical. It wouldn't show blood. She gave a final speech. This was tradition. The condemned always got to speak. And you know what Anne did? She didn't proclaim her innocence outright. That would have endangered her daughter, Elizabeth. Instead, she played it smart. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord and asked the crowd to pray for the king. According to the account from the French poet Lancelot de Carle, who was in London at the time, Anne said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. According to law, I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you." Even facing death, she was protecting her child. Because if Anne accused Henry, if she called him a murderer, a tyrant, which, let's be honest, he was, Elizabeth would have paid the price. So Anne played the game one last time. Then she knelt down. The executioner asked her forgiveness. Another tradition. She forgave him. Her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. And here's a detail that breaks my heart every time. Anne kept moving her head around, probably in fear, trying to anticipate the blow. The executioner, showing surprising kindness, shouted to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." But there was no assistant. It was a trick, a distraction. The moment Anne turned her head toward the voice, he swung. One strike. Clean. Quick. It was over. According to witnesses, Anne's lips were still moving in prayer even after her head was severed. Now, that's probably just muscle spasms. Science tells us that. But imagine being in that crowd, seeing that, believing you just witnessed a martyr. Because that's what Anne became, a martyr. Not for religion, not for politics, but for the dangerous, deadly game of being a woman who dared to want power. And here's the most heartbreaking part. Anne's execution changed nothing. Well, nothing that Henry wanted anyway. Jane Seymour, wife number 3, gave Henry a son, Edward VI, but then she died days after childbirth. Edward would die at 15. Henry would marry 3 more times, growing paranoid, obese, and increasingly tyrannical. He destroyed lives like he was playing checkers. But Anne's legacy lived on in the daughter Henry rejected. Elizabeth, the little girl whose mother died when she was just 2 years old, would grow up to become Elizabeth II, the Virgin Queen, the woman who ruled England for 44 years and turned it into a global superpower. Shakespeare wrote his plays under Elizabeth's rule. England defeated the Spanish Armada under her command. The Elizabethan era is called a golden age for a reason. So in the end, Henry got exactly what he didn't want. His greatest monarch came not from a son, but from the daughter of the woman he murdered. The irony is almost poetic, isn't it? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how we got to that scaffold in 1536, we need to go back. Back to when Henry was young and charming, and Anne was a nobody from a family of social climbers. Back to when their love story hadn't yet become a tragedy. Back to the moment when a king's eyes landed on a woman and thought, I have to have her. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Because in the next chapter of our story, you're going to meet Henry VIII before he became the monster history remembers. You're going to see what made him tick, what haunted him, what turned him into a man who would destroy everything for love, and then destroy love itself. Trust me, once you understand who Henry really was, the fears he carried, the wounds he couldn't heal, Anne's story starts to make a lot more sense, and it becomes even more heartbreaking. So stay with me, we're just getting started, so let me take you back. Not to the execution, not to the scandal, but to the beginning. Before Henry VIII became the tyrant who murdered wives and tore apart kingdoms. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. Henry didn't start out as a monster. He started out as, basically the golden boy of Europe. And understanding who he was before Anne, that's the key to understanding how everything went so catastrophically wrong. Picture this, it's 1509. Henry VIII is just 17 years old when he becomes king. And I want you to imagine what 17-year-old royalty looked like back then. Because it wasn't some awkward teenager playing video games in his room. According to Venetian ambassador Pasqualigo, who wrote a detailed report back to Venice, Henry stood over 6 feet tall, absolutely towering for the 1500s. He had red gold hair, a strong athletic build, and a face that turned heads. The ambassador described him as the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on. But here's what made Henry truly dangerous. He wasn't just pretty. The man was talented. Like annoyingly talented. He could speak Latin, French, and Spanish fluently. He composed music. Yes, actual songs that people still play today. Ever heard Green Sleeves? Legend says Henry wrote it, though historians debate that. He was an expert jouster, archer, and wrestler. The guy once challenged King Francis III of France to a wrestling match at a diplomatic summit, just to show off. And this is important. Henry was loved. The English people were thrilled when he took the throne because his father, Henry VII, had been, kind of a miserable penny pincher. Young Henry was everything his father wasn't. Generous, charismatic, fun. Thomas More, yes, the same Thomas More who'd later be executed for refusing to accept Henry as head of the church, wrote about young Henry with genuine admiration. He said Henry had more learning than any English monarch ever possessed before him. This wasn't just royal propaganda. Henry was legitimately brilliant. But you know what they say about brilliant people? Sometimes they're the most dangerous. Because Henry's intelligence came with something else. An ego the size of England itself. Now here's where the trouble starts. In June of 1509, just weeks after becoming king, Henry married Catherine of Aragon. And before you think, oh great, another arranged marriage, hold on. Because Henry actually chose Catherine. This wasn't forced on him. Catherine had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who died suddenly in 1502. Technically, marrying your brother's widow was forbidden by the Catholic Church, but Pope Julius II granted a special dispensation, basically saying, it's fine. Remember that detail. It's going to come back to haunt everyone. At first, Henry and Catherine seemed genuinely happy. Letters between them, preserved in the British Library, show real affection. Henry called her his true and loving wife. Catherine was intelligent, educated, politically savvy. She'd been raised to be a queen. Literally, she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the power couple who'd funded Christopher Columbus. When Henry went off to war with France in 1513, you know who he left in charge of England? Catherine. And she crushed it. She actually led the English forces to victory against Scotland at the Battle of Flodden, writing to Henry, "I thought to send him a piece of the King of Scots' coat to your banner, but our Englishmen would not suffer it." So we've got a power couple, right? Young, attractive, talented, ruling one of Europe's major kingdoms. What could possibly go wrong? Children. Or rather, the lack of male children. And this is where Henry's story turns from fairy tale to tragedy. Here's what happened. Catherine got pregnant. A lot. Between 1510 and 1518, she had at least 6 pregnancies. But here's the heartbreaking part. Only one child survived infancy. One. A daughter named Mary, born in 1516. Every other pregnancy ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the baby dying within weeks. According to historian Alison Weir, who documented all of Catherine's pregnancies in her book, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, there was a son born in 1511 who lived for 52 days. They'd already named him Henry, already started planning his reign, and then he died. Can you imagine that? The hope, the celebration, and then nothing. Again, and again, and again. Now, before we judge Henry too harshly here, we need to understand what this meant in the 1500s. This wasn't just about wanting a son because of sexism, though yes, that was absolutely part of it. This was about survival, about stability. England had just emerged from the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that had torn the country apart for 30 years. Henry's own father had won the throne by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile, and in Henry's mind, in everyone's mind at that time, a kingdom without a male heir was a kingdom headed for chaos. Plus, there was zero precedent for a queen ruling England in her own right. The closest example was Matilda back in the 1100s, and that had resulted in, you guessed it, civil war. So when people ask, why was Henry so obsessed with having a son? This is why. In his mind, having only a daughter wasn't just disappointing, it was dangerous. But here's what's fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Henry never blamed himself. Not once. He blamed Catherine. Now, we know today that the sex of a baby is determined by the father's genetics, not the mother's. But they didn't know that in the 1500s. So in Henry's mind, Catherine's inability to give him sons meant something was wrong with her. Or worse, that God was punishing them for something. And oh, did Henry spiral into superstition about this? According to Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, whose dispatches are like the tabloid gossip columns of the Tudor court, Henry became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. Remember how she'd been married to his brother first? Henry started obsessing over a verse from the Bible, Leviticus 20:21, which says, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." Childless. That word haunted Henry. Never mind that he had Mary. In his mind, daughters didn't count. He became convinced that God was punishing him for marrying Catherine, even though the Pope himself had said it was fine. This is peak Henry logic. When things went his way, God approved. When they didn't, everyone else was wrong. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but lots of kings had mistresses when their marriages weren't working out. Why didn't Henry just do that? And oh, he did. Henry had several affairs. The most notable was with Mary Boleyn, yes, Anne's sister. We'll get to that drama later. He also had at least one illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, with a mistress named Bessie Blount. And here's the kicker. Fitzroy was healthy, strong, smart. He lived to be 17. This proved in Henry's mind that he could father sons. The problem was Catherine, but having a healthy, illegitimate son actually made things worse, not better. Because now Henry knew it was possible. He knew what he was missing. And medieval psychology being what it was, this knowledge festered. It became an obsession. British historian David Starkey, in his documentary Henry VIII, Mind of a Tyrant, argues that this is the turning point, the moment when Henry's personality started to darken. The generous, jovial king began to show cracks of something else: paranoia, entitlement, a terrifying certainty that whatever he wanted, God wanted too. Because if you're a king who believes in the divine right to rule, that God himself chose you to lead, then your desires aren't just personal, they're holy, they're righteous. And this is the Henry that Anne Boleyn would meet, not the monster yet. But not the golden boy anymore either. He was something in between, something unstable, a man with everything the world could offer, except the one thing he wanted most. A man who was used to winning, to being admired, to getting his way. A man whose marriage had become a daily reminder of failure. By the early 1520s, Henry was in his 30s, still handsome, still powerful, but you could see the shift. The portraits from this era show it. There's a hardness in his eyes that wasn't there before. Catherine, meanwhile, was in her 40s. By Tudor standards, she was past childbearing age, and both of them knew it. The dream of a male heir from their marriage, dead. So Henry did what many men do when their first marriage becomes difficult. He started looking around, at court, at the young women who attended Catherine as ladies-in-waiting, women who laughed at his jokes, who found him charming, who represented possibility instead of disappointment. And that's when he saw her. Not Catherine, not Mary Boleyn, the sister he'd already bedded and discarded, but the other Boleyn girl, the one with the dark eyes and the sharp wit, the one who'd just returned from France with sophisticated manners and an air of mystery, the one who would look a king in the eye and not immediately fall at his feet. Her name was Anne Boleyn. And unlike every other woman Henry had pursued, Anne had a strategy, a dangerous, brilliant, utterly reckless strategy. She said no, and in that single word, no, she set in motion a chain of events that would destroy a kingdom, rewrite Christianity in England, and cost her everything, including her head. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again, because before we meet Anne properly, before we understand her game, we need to see exactly how desperate Henry had become, how ready he was for someone, anyone, to make him feel alive again. Coming up next, you're going to meet the woman who said no to a king. And trust me, once you understand who Anne Boleyn really was, where she came from, what she learned, how she calculated every single move, you'll realize this wasn't just a love story. This was a chess match, and for 7 years, Anne was winning. Stay with me. This is where it gets really good. Anne Boleyn walked into Henry VIII's court sometime around 1522. And here's what you need to understand right away. She was nobody special. Not a princess. Not from some ancient noble bloodline. The Boleyns were what we'd call today new money. Merchants who'd clawed their way up the social ladder through strategic marriages and shameless ambition. Anne's great-grandfather had been Lord Mayor of London. Respectable, sure, but hardly royal. So how did this woman, this daughter of a social climber, end up capturing the obsessive attention of the most powerful man in England? That's the story we're diving into now, and I promise you, it's not what you think. Let's start with what Anne looked like, because here's where history gets interesting. We don't actually have any portraits of Anne that were definitely painted during her lifetime. Everything we have comes from later, often painted with political bias. But we do have eyewitness descriptions, and they're complicated. The Venetian ambassador, these Italian diplomats were basically the gossip columnists of their time, described Anne as not one of the handsomest women in the world. Ouch, right? He noted that she was of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, and a bosom not much raised. In other words, by Tudor beauty standards, which favoured pale skin, blonde hair and curves, Anne was unconventional. But here's where it gets fascinating. That same ambassador added something else. He said she had eyes which are black and beautiful. And another observer, a man named Lancelot de Carl, who actually knew Anne personally, wrote that she had eyes always most attractive, which she knew how to use with effect. That phrase, knew how to use with effect, tells you everything. Anne wasn't classically beautiful, but she had something more dangerous than beauty. She had presence, charisma, intelligence, the ability to work a room. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who maybe isn't the most conventionally attractive person, but when they walk in, you can't look away? That was Anne. And in a court full of pretty girls batting their eyelashes at the king, being different was her superpower. Now here's what made Anne truly dangerous. France. Because before Anne came to Henry's court, she'd spent nearly 7 years in the French court, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, the wife of King Francis VIII. And if you know anything about French court in the 1510s and 1520s, you know it was like the Harvard of sophistication and political intrigue. French historian Retha Warnecker, in her biography, The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, explains that Anne's time in France transformed her completely. She learned to speak French fluently, so fluently that witnesses said she had no English accent at all. She learned French fashion, which was way more daring and elegant than the stiff English style. She learned music, dance, poetry, but most importantly, she learned the art of courtly love. Here's what courtly love meant in Renaissance France. It was basically a game, a sophisticated, flirtatious, teasing game where noble women would keep admirers at arm's length, creating desire through distance. It was all about the chase, the longing, the you can look but you can't touch psychology. In England, women were expected to be modest, obedient, and frankly, kind of boring. In France, women were expected to be witty, charming, and strategically seductive, without actually giving in. Anne mastered this game, and when she returned to England around 1521 or 1522, historians debate the exact date. She brought these French skills with her. Imagine being an English courtier used to giggly, submissive English girls, and suddenly this woman shows up who dresses differently, talks differently, carries herself with this continental confidence. Anne wasn't just different, she was exotic. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, Anne's sister, Mary. Because before Henry noticed Anne, he'd already had an affair with Mary Boleyn. And this is where the Boleyn family strategy gets really messy. According to most historians, Mary was Henry's mistress sometime between 1520 and 1525. We don't have exact dates, but we have enough evidence to know it happened. Mary was sweet, compliant, pretty. She did what Henry wanted, and then Henry got bored and moved on. That's what always happened with Henry's mistresses. They'd have their moment in the spotlight, maybe get some gifts, maybe get a comfortable marriage arranged for them afterward, and then, next. Now imagine you're Anne. You've watched your own sister get used and discarded by the king. You've seen how that game ends. Do you really want to be next? Do you really want to be just another notch on the royal bedpost? Anne made a calculation. A brilliant, audacious, incredibly risky calculation. She decided that if Henry wanted her, he'd have to marry her, not as a mistress, as a queen. Let me repeat that because it's absolutely wild. Anne Boleyn, daughter of a merchant family, told the King of England, "No, you can't sleep with me unless you marry me." And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Here's what historian Eric Ives, probably the foremost expert on Anne Boleyn, writes in his book The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn. Anne refused to become Henry's mistress. This was not morality. This was strategy. And he's right. Because Anne had watched the pattern. She'd seen what happened to women who gave in. They got nothing, no security, no power, no future. But the king's wife? That was everything. Power, security, status, wealth. Your children would be legitimate heirs to the throne. So Anne played the only card she had: scarcity. She made herself scarce, unavailable. The one thing Henry couldn't have. And oh, did it drive him crazy. Here's where the psychology gets really interesting. There's this concept in behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. If you win every single time, you get bored. If you lose every single time, you give up. But if you win sometimes, randomly, unpredictably, you become obsessed. You can't stop trying. That's what Anne did to Henry. Sometimes she'd flirt with him. Sometimes she'd completely ignore him. Sometimes she'd laugh at his jokes. Sometimes she'd leave the room. According to courtier George Cavendish, who witnessed much of this firsthand and later wrote about it in his biography of Cardinal Wolsey, Anne would send Henry mixed signals constantly. She'd accept his gifts but refuse his advances. She'd dance with him but not let him get too close. She'd write him letters that were affectionate but never quite promised anything. And Henry, who'd never been told no in his entire life, he lost his mind. Let me paint you a specific scene that really captures this dynamic. It's 1526. Henry's thrown a masquerade ball. These were huge, elaborate parties where everyone wore masks and costumes. Henry, trying to be romantic and spontaneous, shows up dressed as a shepherd. Very pastoral. Very, "I'm just a simple man who loves you." He expects Anne to be charmed. You know what Anne did? She danced with someone else. Just completely ignored him. And according to the Spanish ambassador's reports, Henry spent the entire night following her around like a puppy. The King of England, following a merchant's daughter around at his own party. Now, some people ask, was Anne just playing hard to get, or did she genuinely not want him? And honestly, it was probably both. Because here's the thing about Anne that makes her so fascinating. She was ambitious, fiercely ambitious. Her family had raised her to climb the social ladder, and marrying the king was the ultimate climb. But she was also smart enough to know that one wrong move could destroy her. She'd seen what happened to her sister. She'd seen what happened to Bessie Blount, who'd given Henry a son, and then been married off to some minor nobleman and forgotten. Anne knew that the moment she slept with Henry, her leverage was gone. So she held out, month after month, year after year. And here's what's fascinating. This strategy wouldn't have worked with most kings. Most powerful men, when told no, would just move on to someone easier. But Henry was different. Remember what we talked about earlier, his ego, his obsession with getting what he wanted, his belief that God wanted him to have whatever he desired. Anne telling him no didn't make him give up. It made him more determined. Plus, there's another factor we can't ignore. Henry was getting older. It's now the mid-1520s. He's in his mid-30s. The golden boy is starting to show wear. He's put on weight. His athletic prowess isn't what it used to be. And Catherine, his wife, is in her 40s. way past childbearing age by Tudor standards. Henry's running out of time to get a male heir. The urgency is building, and here comes Anne. Young, she was probably in her mid-20s when this started. Sophisticated, different from anyone else at court. And most importantly, she's proven she's fertile, right? Her sister Mary had children. Good Boleyn genes. In Henry's increasingly desperate mind, Anne represents his last real chance at getting a son. So the chase continues. According to the love letters, 17 of them that survived, now preserved in the Vatican Library, Henry pursued Anne for years. Years. We're talking about 1525 or 1526 when he first started seriously pursuing her, and they didn't actually get married until 1533. That's 7 years. 7 years of Henry writing desperate letters, sending gifts, making promises, while Anne kept him at exactly the right distance, close enough to stay interested, far enough to stay desperate. But here's the question that haunted Anne, even as she played this dangerous game. What happens when you finally say yes? What happens when the chase ends? Because at some point, Henry would either get her or give up. And if he got her, if she finally became his wife, if the mystery was solved and the prize was won, would he still want her? It's the ultimate catch-22. The only way to keep Henry obsessed was to keep saying no. But saying no forever meant she'd never actually win the prize. She had to time it perfectly. Say yes too soon, lose his interest. Say yes too late, he moves on to someone else. Anne was walking a tightrope, and one slip would mean a very, very long fall. Now, if you've ever been in a relationship with someone who's hot and cold, someone who keeps you guessing, someone who makes you work for their attention, you know how consuming that is, how it takes over your brain. You can't focus on anything else. Every text message, every interaction, you're analysing it, trying to figure out what it means. That's what Anne did to Henry. Except Henry wasn't some modern guy texting at 2 a.m. Henry was the King of England. And when his obsession took over, when he couldn't think about anything except getting Anne, well, kingdoms trembled. In just a moment, you're going to see exactly how far Henry was willing to go to prove his love. We're talking about 17 letters that are so passionate, so desperate, so absolutely unhinged, that when you read them today, they don't sound like they came from a king. They sound like they came from a teenager who just discovered heartbreak. And these letters, they're about to show you the exact moment when Henry's obsession crossed from love into something much darker, something that would ultimately destroy everything, including Anne herself. Let's keep going. All right, imagine finding your ex's old text messages to you. You know, the ones from when you were first dating, the ones that are simultaneously sweet and cringeworthy. Now multiply that embarrassment by 1,000, make those messages public record in the Vatican Library, and have historians analyse them for the next 500 years. That's basically what happened to Henry VIII. Because here's something most people don't know. 17 of Henry's love letters to Anne Boleyn survived. 17 desperate, passionate, increasingly unhinged letters that give us a front row seat to a king losing his mind over a woman. And when I say these letters are intense, I mean they read like they were written by someone who just discovered what obsession feels like. These letters are currently housed in the Vatican Library, which is ironic considering Henry would eventually break from the Vatican because of Anne, but they ended up there because Anne's family or someone at court sent them to the Pope, probably to prove just how serious Henry was about wanting an annulment from Catherine. Like, look, Your Holiness, this man is completely gone. Please just give him what he wants before he does something crazy. Spoiler alert, the Pope didn't, and Henry absolutely did something crazy. Now here's the fascinating part. We only have Henry's letters. Anne's responses, gone. either destroyed deliberately or lost to history. So we're only hearing one side of this conversation, which makes Henry sound even more desperate because we can only imagine what Anne was writing back to keep him this hooked. Let's start with the early letters, because they show Henry at his most vulnerable. And for a king, a man who was literally told from birth that he was chosen by God, vulnerability didn't come naturally. In one of the first letters, probably written around 1526 or 1527, Henry writes to Anne, "I would you were in my arms, or I in yours, for I think it long since I kissed you." Read that again. The King of England is saying he misses kissing someone. This isn't some grand political alliance discussion. This is a man who can't stop thinking about physical intimacy. And notice the language. "I think it long since I kissed you." That phrasing tells us they'd already had some physical contact. Maybe just kissing, maybe more. But enough that Henry knew what he was missing. Then he continues, "Written with the hand of him that was, is, and shall be yours by his will, H.R. H.R. Henricus Rex, Henry the King." Even his signature is trying to impress her. "I was, is, and shall be yours." That's eternity language. That's forever language. That's the kind of thing you say when you're 19 and think you found your soulmate. Except Henry was in his mid-30s, married and running a kingdom. But here's where it gets really interesting. British historian David Starkey, in his analysis of these letters published in Six Wives, the Queens of Henry VIII, points out that Henry's handwriting gets increasingly erratic as the letters progress. The early ones are careful, measured. By the later letters, the writing is rushed, messy. You can literally see the obsession taking over. In another letter, Henry writes, "Henceforth my heart shall be dedicated to you alone, greatly desirous that my body could be as well." Okay, let's unpack that. My heart shall be dedicated to you alone. Romantic, right? But then, greatly desirous that my body could be as well. That's Henry basically saying, I want to sleep with you, but you won't let me, and it's driving me insane. This is a king, mind you. He could have any woman at court, but the one he wants keeps saying no. And you know what? Good for Anne. Because this is the power dynamic at play. She's turned the tables completely. In any normal situation, the king has all the power. But by withholding what Henry wants most, Anne's made herself the powerful one. She's the one in control. And Henry, for maybe the first time in his life, isn't. Now here's where modern psychology becomes really relevant. Have you ever wanted something more because you couldn't have it? Maybe it's a relationship that didn't work out, or a job you didn't get, or even just a sold-out concert ticket. That scarcity, that unavailability makes the desire stronger. Psychologists call this reactance theory. When our freedom to have something is restricted, we want it even more. That's exactly what's happening to Henry. Every time Anne says no, every time she keeps him at arm's length, the obsession deepens. And we can track this in the letters. They start sweet and romantic, but they slowly shift into something more demanding. Listen to this one. Seeing my darling is absent, I can do no less than send her some flesh, representing my name, which is heart flesh for Henry, prognosticating that hereafter, God willing, you must enjoy some of mine, which he pleased, I would were now. Okay, first of all, sending someone deer meat as a romantic gesture is very Tudor. But look at the subtext here. You must enjoy some of mine. That's not a request anymore. That's a statement. You must. You will. The language is shifting from please to eventually this will happen. And then there's this absolute gem of a letter where Henry draws a tiny heart with the letters A and H intertwined, and he writes Anne's initials over and over in the margins like a teenager doodling in a notebook. I'm not kidding. The King of England, probably the most powerful man in Europe at this time, is drawing hearts and initials. If Instagram existed in 1527, Henry would have been posting "thinking about you" on Anne's photos at 2 a.m. But beneath the romance, there's something darker brewing. Because as the months turn into years, remember, this chase lasted 7 years, you can sense Henry's frustration building. The language becomes more possessive, more urgent. In one letter he writes, "For I have been for above 1 whole year struck with the dart of love, and not yet sure whether I shall fail, or find a place in your heart and grounded affection." Not yet sure. After a whole year of pursuing her, he still doesn't know if she really loves him. And that uncertainty is eating him alive. This is the psychological trap Anne's created. She's given him just enough hope to keep him chasing, but never enough certainty to satisfy him. Eric Ives, in his definitive biography, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn, argues that this uncertainty was deliberate strategy on Anne's part. She had to keep Henry interested without giving in, but she also couldn't let him get so frustrated that he gave up. It's an incredibly delicate balance. One wrong move and she loses everything. And here's what makes this even more intense. Anne wasn't just dealing with Henry's desire, she was dealing with his ego. Because for Henry, being told no wasn't just frustrating, it was incomprehensible. He'd spent his entire life getting whatever he wanted. Women threw themselves at him, men bowed before him. God himself, according to Henry's worldview, had chosen him to rule. So Anne's rejection didn't just wound his pride, it challenged his entire understanding of how the world worked. Let me read you one more letter, because this one shows just how far gone Henry was. "Mine own sweetheart, this shall be to advertise you of the great loneliness that I find here since your departing. I would you were in mine arms, that I might a little dispel my sorrow." The King of England is lonely. Think about that. He's surrounded by courtiers, servants, advisors, and probably hundreds of people at any given moment. But he's lonely because Anne isn't there. That's not love. That's obsession. That's codependence. That's a man who's made another person responsible for his emotional well-being. And if you've ever been in a relationship like that, where someone makes you their entire source of happiness, you know how suffocating that feels, how much pressure that puts on you. Anne was carrying the emotional weight of a king's happiness on her shoulders. No wonder she was strategic. No wonder she was careful. But here's the question we have to ask. Did Anne love Henry back? Or was this always just a power play? Historian Alison Weir argues that Anne probably did develop genuine feelings for Henry at some point. I mean, he was charming when he wanted to be. He was powerful, intelligent, cultured, and he was pursuing her with an intensity that would be flattering to anyone. But the problem with Anne is that we'll never really know her true feelings because her letters are gone. All we have is Henry's perspective, and Henry only saw what Anne wanted him to see. What we do know is this. By 1527, after about a year or two of this intense pursuit, Henry made a decision. He was going to marry Anne, not as a mistress, as his actual wife, which meant Catherine of Aragon had to go. And that's where things get messy, because you can't just divorce the Queen of England, especially when she's the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain, and especially when the Catholic Church has rules about marriage. But Henry didn't care about rules anymore. He was too far gone. The letters prove it. This wasn't a rational decision. This was a man so consumed by desire that he was willing to tear apart his entire kingdom to get what he wanted. Think about the modern parallels here. We've all seen powerful men destroy their careers, their families, their reputations for an affair or an obsession. Politicians, CEOs, celebrities. The pattern is always the same. They start to believe their own hype. They convince themselves they're entitled to whatever they want, and they make increasingly reckless decisions. That's Henry in these letters, a man who's convinced himself that his desire for Anne isn't just personal, it's righteous. It's what God wants. Because if God chose him to be king, then obviously God wants him to be happy, right? And if Anne makes him happy, then God must want him to have Anne. It's circular logic, it's narcissistic, and it's about to lead to one of the biggest religious upheavals in European history. Because here's what's coming. Henry's about to go to war, not with soldiers, with words, with lawyers, with theology. He's about to challenge the Pope himself, argue with Scripture, and eventually, when he doesn't get what he wants, he's going to do the unthinkable. He's going to break England away from the Catholic Church entirely. 1,000 years of religious unity gone. Monasteries dissolved. Treasures seized. People executed. All because a king wrote 17 obsessive love letters to a woman who knew exactly how to keep him wanting more. And the wildest part? Anne probably had no idea how far Henry would actually go. She was playing a game, yes, a dangerous game, but breaking with Rome, starting the English Reformation, that wasn't part of the plan. That was Henry taking his obsession to a level no one could have predicted. So buckle up, because what happens next isn't just a love story anymore. It's a political earthquake that's going to reshape England, challenge the power of the Catholic Church, and set the stage for centuries of religious conflict. All because a king couldn't handle being told no. Ready? Let's watch it all burn. There's a moment in every relationship where you realize you've gone too far to turn back. Maybe you've said something you can't unsay. Maybe you've made a promise you can't break. For Henry VIII, that moment came in 1527 when he looked at Cardinal Wolsey, his closest advisor, the second most powerful man in England, and said 5 words that would change history. I need an annulment now. Not a divorce, an annulment. Because in the Catholic Church, divorce didn't exist. Marriage was a sacrament ordained by God, and what God joined together, no man could separate. But an annulment, that was different. An annulment meant the marriage had never been valid in the first place. It meant you could pretend the whole thing never happened and walk away clean. And Henry needed this to be clean, because he wasn't just trying to end a marriage, he was trying to rewrite 20 years of history. Let's set the scene. It's 1527. Henry's been married to Catherine of Aragon for 18 years. She's been a good wife, a good queen, politically savvy, loyal. But she's 42 years old now, and in Tudor times, that meant her childbearing years were definitively over. No more chances for a son. And Henry, sitting there in his mid-30s, watching other kings produce male heirs left and right, is spiralling into panic. But here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. Henry couldn't just admit, hey, I want a younger wife who can give me sons. That would make him look shallow, selfish, cruel. No, Henry needed a moral justification, a righteous reason. And oh boy, did he find one. Remember that Bible verse I mentioned earlier? Leviticus 20:21. Let me give you the full context, because this verse became Henry's entire case. It says, if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Childless. That word again. And technically, Catherine had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur first back in 1501. Arthur died 5 months later. Historians still debate whether the marriage was even consummated, but the marriage had existed. So Henry, with the kind of selective biblical interpretation that would make a modern politician proud, decided that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Never mind that the Pope had granted a special dispensation allowing the marriage. Never mind that Mary, his daughter with Catherine, very much existed. In Henry's mind, childless meant no sons, and therefore the marriage was cursed. This whole situation became known as the Great Matter, and when I say it consumed England for 6 years, I mean it was all anyone talked about. Imagine if today's celebrity divorce drama, Supreme Court case, and constitutional crisis all happened at once. That's the Great Matter. Henry put Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in charge of getting the annulment. Now, Wolsey was probably the most powerful non-royal person in England at this time. He was Lord Chancellor, Archbishop of York, and a Cardinal of the Catholic Church. According to historian John Guy, who wrote the definitive biography, The Cardinal's Court, Wolsey essentially ran England's government, while Henry focused on hunting, jousting, and now obsessing over Anne Boleyn. If anyone could get the Pope to grant an annulment, it was Wolsey. Except Wolsey had a massive problem. Actually, he had several massive problems, but the biggest one was sitting in Rome wearing a papal tiara, Pope Clement VII. Now here's where European politics crashes headfirst into Henry's love life. Pope Clement VII was in an impossible situation. Not because he personally cared about Henry's marriage. Honestly, popes had granted annulments for way flimsier reasons before. But in 1527, Clement had a much bigger problem than Henry's love life. His name was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles V just happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Let me paint you the political chessboard here. Charles V controlled Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and had the most powerful army in Europe. In May 1527, literally right when Henry was pushing for his annulment, Charles V's army sacked Rome. Like, actually invaded and pillaged the Vatican. It was called the Sack of Rome, and it was brutal. According to historian Judith Hook's account in The Sack of Rome 1527, thousands died, churches were looted, and Pope Clement himself was trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo, essentially a prisoner. So put yourself in Clement's shoes. You're being held captive by an emperor whose aunt is the woman Henry wants to humiliate and discard. Are you going to grant Henry his annulment and make Charles even angrier? Or are you going to stall, delay, and hope this whole thing somehow resolves itself? Clement chose option 2, stall forever. But Wolsey didn't know this at first, so he tried everything. And I mean everything. The legal arguments he came up with, documented in the Vatican archives, are actually kind of impressive in their creativity. Wolsey argued that the original papal dispensation allowing Henry to marry Catherine had been flawed. He argued that Leviticus clearly forbade the marriage. He even brought in teams of theologians to debate the finer points of biblical law. According to state papers from 1527 to 1529, preserved in the British National Archives, Wolsey wrote letter after letter to Rome, each one more desperate than the last, and Rome responded by scheduling hearings, requesting more documentation, asking for theological clarifications, classic bureaucratic stalling. Month after month, year after year, nothing happened. Meanwhile, Henry's getting more and more obsessed with Anne. Remember, he's been chasing her for years now, writing those desperate love letters, promising her she'll be queen. And Anne's watching this whole thing, probably thinking, did I bet on the wrong horse? Is this actually going to work? Because here's the thing about Anne's position. She'd committed fully. She'd rejected being Henry's mistress, held out for marriage, and now her entire future depended on Henry actually getting that annulment. If he couldn't, she'd wasted years of her life. She'd be the woman who turned down a king and got nothing in return. At court, people were already whispering about her, calling her the concubine, spreading rumours. Catherine's supporters hated her. The common people loved Catherine and saw Anne as a homewrecker, Anne had made herself the most controversial woman in England, and it would all be for nothing if Henry couldn't deliver. So Anne did what any smart strategist would do. She got involved. According to historian Eric Ives, Anne started meeting with reformist theologians, people who were critical of the Catholic Church's authority. She started reading forbidden books. She started pushing Henry toward more radical solutions. And Henry, desperate to please her, started listening. By 1529, 2 years into this mess, Wolsey was failing. He'd convinced the Pope to send a papal legate, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, to England to hold a trial. Finally, progress. Except Campeggio had secret instructions from the Pope. Stall more. Drag it out. Don't actually decide anything. The trial opened in June 1529 at Blackfriars in London. It was a spectacle. Both Henry and Catherine appeared in person, unusual for royalty, and Catherine, knowing this was her moment, gave a performance that's still remembered today. According to eyewitness George Cavendish's account, Catherine walked across the court, knelt at Henry's feet, and gave a speech in broken English. She'd been in England for nearly 30 years but still had a Spanish accent. She said, "Sir, I beseech you for all the love that hath been between us. Let me have justice and right. I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife. Can you imagine the emotional weight in that room? A wife of 20 years, publicly begging her husband not to discard her. And Henry sitting there, knowing Anne was watching, knowing he had to stay strong. According to the records, Henry barely looked at Catherine. Catherine continued, I have seen your wife for 20 years and more, and by me ye have had divers children. When ye had me at first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid without touch of man." That last line was critical. She was publicly declaring that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, which would invalidate Henry's entire biblical argument. Basically, Catherine was calling Henry's bluff in front of everyone, and then she stood up and walked out, just left, refused to participate further. According to historian Garrett Mattingly in Catherine of Aragon, the court tried to call her back 3 times. She ignored them. It was a power move, a statement that said, I don't recognise this court's authority over my marriage. Henry was furious. Campeggio continued to stall, and by July 1529, the trial was adjourned with no decision. Campeggio packed up and went back to Rome, and just like that, 2 years of work collapsed. For Wolsey, this was catastrophic. He'd promised Henry results and delivered nothing, and Henry, who'd built his entire personality around getting what he wanted, was being publicly humiliated by the Pope, by Catherine, by the entire situation. Someone had to pay, and that someone was Wolsey. In October 1529, Wolsey was arrested on charges of praemunire, basically putting the Pope's authority above the king's. All his property was seized, all his wealth gone. The man who'd been the second most powerful person in England was suddenly stripped of everything. According to Cavendish's biography, Wolsey died a year later while being transported to London for trial, probably from stress and heartbreak. His last words were reportedly, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." That's heartbreaking. A man who dedicated his life to serving Henry, destroyed because he couldn't perform a miracle. But here's what Wolsey's fall proved. Henry had reached a breaking point. For 3 years he'd played by the rules. He'd gone through proper channels. He'd been patient with Rome. And where did it get him? Nowhere. The Pope wouldn't budge. Catherine wouldn't cooperate. The annulment seemed impossible. So Henry made a decision that would echo through centuries. If the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, he'd find another way. a way that didn't require Rome's permission, a way that would give him total control over his own marriage, his own church, his own kingdom. And Anne Boleyn, watching all this unfold, probably realised something terrifying. She'd awakened a monster, because the man willing to destroy Cardinal Wolsey, his most loyal servant, to get what he wanted, that man was capable of anything, including eventually destroying Anne herself. But for now, Anne's still winning, because in the next part of our story you're going to witness something unprecedented, something that hadn't happened in England for over 1,000 years. Henry's about to declare war on the Catholic Church itself. He's about to claim powers that no English king had ever claimed before. He's about to rip his entire kingdom away from Rome and reshape Christianity in England according to his own desires, and all of it, every monastery dissolved, every monk displaced, every life disrupted, all of it happens because one man couldn't accept being told no. Let's see how far he'll go. You know what's wild? Sometimes the biggest revolutions in history don't start with armies or uprisings. They start with one person saying, "You know what? I don't need your permission anymore." That's exactly what happened in the early 1530s. Henry VIII, after years of begging the Pope for an annulment and getting nothing but bureaucratic runaround, had an epiphany. Actually, epiphany is too spiritual a word. Let's call it what it was. A tantrum. A royal, kingdom-shattering tantrum that would reshape Christianity in England forever. Because if the Pope wouldn't give Henry what he wanted, Henry would just stop recognizing the Pope's authority. Simple, right? Except this wasn't just about one marriage. This was about breaking a religious bond that had existed since Christianity arrived in England over 1,000 years earlier, since before the Norman conquest, since before England was even really England, and Henry did it anyway. For Anne Boleyn. Let me walk you through how this actually happened, because it wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of legal manoeuvres, each one more radical than the last, that slowly stripped away Rome's power until there was nothing left. It started in 1531. Henry, working with his new advisor Thomas Cromwell, a brilliant, ruthless lawyer who made Wolsey look soft, began pressuring the English clergy. In February 1531, according to parliamentary records preserved in the National Archives, Henry basically blackmailed the entire Church of England. He accused them of praemonia, recognising the Pope's authority over the kings, and demanded they pay a massive fine of $100,000. That's roughly equivalent to tens of millions today. But here's the genius part. Henry offered to pardon them if they'd do one thing: recognise him as supreme head of the Church of England. Can you imagine being a bishop in that meeting? For your entire life, you've been taught that the Pope is Christ's representative on earth, the ultimate spiritual authority. And now your king is saying, "Actually, I'm in charge of the church now. Cool?" The clergy freaked out. They negotiated. They added the phrase "as far as the law of Christ allows," basically a loophole that meant they weren't technically betraying their faith. According to historian Diarmaid MacCulloch in Thomas Cranmer: A Life, this compromise satisfied no one but allowed everyone to save face, for now. By 1532, Henry ramped things up. He forced Parliament to pass the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which sounds boring but was actually revolutionary. This act, drafted primarily by Thomas Cromwell, declared that England was an empire complete unto itself, and therefore no foreign power, meaning Rome, had any jurisdiction over English affairs. Let me read you a key line from this act, because it's basically Henry's Declaration of Independence. This realm of England is an empire, governed by one supreme head and king, unto whom a body politic be bounden and owe to bear next to God a natural and humble obedience. Next to God, not under the Pope. Next to God. That's not just confidence, that's megalomania. Henry literally positioned himself as second only to God in the hierarchy of authority, and Parliament, either too scared to oppose him or genuinely believing in the cause, passed it. Now here's where Anne comes back into the picture, because by late 1532, she finally gave in. After 6 or 7 years of making Henry wait, Anne apparently decided the time was right. We don't know exactly when they consummated their relationship, but historians generally agree it happened sometime in late 1532, possibly during a trip to Calais. And by January 1533, Anne was pregnant. This changed everything. Because if Anne was having Henry's child, and if that child was a boy, Henry needed that child to be legitimate, which meant he needed to marry Anne immediately, which meant he couldn't wait for Rome anymore. So on January 25th, 1533, Henry and Anne got married, in secret, in a private chapel, with only a handful of witnesses. According to the Venetian ambassador's report sent back to Venice and preserved in their archives, most of England didn't even know the marriage had happened until months later. But here's the problem. Henry was still technically married to Catherine, so this secret marriage to Anne was, legally speaking, bigamy. Unless someone could declare the marriage to Catherine invalid, enter Thomas Cranmer. Henry had recently appointed Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious position in England. And unlike the previous archbishop, Cranmer was a reformer who supported Henry's cause. In May 1533, Cranmer held a special court at Dunstable and declared, surprise, that Henry's marriage to Catherine had never been valid. Just like that, 24 years of marriage erased with the legal ruling. 5 days later, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Anne valid, and on June 1st, 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Henry had done it. After 7 years of fighting, waiting, and political manoeuvring, Anne Boleyn was finally his wife, finally his queen, and she was pregnant with what Henry desperately hoped was his son. But the story doesn't end there, because breaking with Rome had consequences. Big ones. In March 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession. This declared that Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid, Mary was illegitimate, and any children from Henry's marriage to Anne would be the rightful heirs to the throne. Everyone in England, and I mean everyone, was required to swear an oath accepting this. Most people did, but not everyone, so Thomas More refused. And this is where our story gets really tragic. Thomas More was, by all accounts, one of the greatest minds of his generation. A lawyer, philosopher, author, he'd written Utopia, one of the most influential political texts of the Renaissance. He'd been Henry's friend, close friend. They'd walked in the gardens together discussing philosophy and theology. Henry had appointed More as Lord Chancellor after Wolsey's fall, but More couldn't accept Henry as head of the church. His Catholic faith was too deep. According to his daughter, Margaret Roper's letters, preserved in the British Library, More told his family, "I have, since I came into prison, not passed the value of 1 farthing in this world, and I trust God maketh me a wretched man for his sake, that I should be the more ready to go to him." More knew what refusing the oath meant, death, but he couldn't betray his conscience. Henry had More arrested in April 1534. For over a year, More was held in the Tower of London. Henry kept hoping More would change his mind. He'd been a friend after all. But More stayed silent, refused to explain his reasons, thinking that silence might save him. It didn't. In July 1535, Thomas More was tried for treason. The trial was a sham. According to historian Peter Ackroyd's biography, The Life of Thomas More, false testimony was introduced. More defended himself brilliantly, but the verdict was predetermined: guilty. On July 6, 1535, More was executed, beheaded on Tower Hill. According to eyewitness accounts, his last words were, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." Think about that. The king's good servant, but God's first. Even facing death, More maintained his principles, and he didn't condemn Henry. He said he was still the king's servant, but God came first. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, was executed 2 weeks earlier for the same reason. Fisher was 75 years old, frail, sick. They had to help him up the scaffold, but he refused to compromise his beliefs. These weren't political dissidents. These weren't rebels trying to overthrow Henry. These were men of conscience who simply couldn't accept that the king had authority over their souls, and Henry killed them for it. Here's the thing about power. Once you start using it to eliminate opposition, where do you stop? Henry had crossed a line. He'd executed his friends over a disagreement about church authority, and once that became acceptable, what else became acceptable? But Henry wasn't done, not even close. Because breaking with Rome wasn't just about claiming authority, it was also about money, lots and lots of money. In 1536, Henry began what's called the dissolution of the monasteries. And when I say this was one of the largest wealth transfers in English history, I'm not exaggerating. There were around 900 monasteries, abbeys, and religious houses in England at this time. They owned approximately 1/3 of all land in England. 1/3. They were massively wealthy institutions that had accumulated property, gold, artwork, and treasures over centuries. Thomas Cromwell, serving as Henry's right-hand man, sent commissioners throughout England to assess the monasteries. According to the official reports, preserved in the National Archives, these commissioners were supposed to investigate corruption and moral failings, and surprise, surprise, they found exactly what they were looking for. Reports of monks living in luxury, of sexual misconduct, of laziness. Were some monasteries corrupt? Probably. But were they all deserving of total destruction? Absolutely not. This was a pretext, a justification for what Henry really wanted: their money. Between 1536 and 1541, all the monasteries were dissolved, closed, emptied. The monks and nuns were pensioned off, if they were lucky, or simply turned out onto the streets. The buildings were often torn down, their stones sold off or used for other construction. The treasures, gold, silver, jewels, ancient manuscripts, were seized for the crown. Historian G.W. Bernard, in The King's Reformation, estimates that Henry gained approximately $1.3 million from the dissolution, equivalent to roughly $500 million to $1 billion in today's money. It was the biggest government cash grab in English history. But the human cost? Devastating. Monasteries weren't just religious institutions. They were social services. They provided food for the poor, medical care for the sick, education for children, hospitality for travellers. When Henry destroyed them, he destroyed England's entire social safety net. And for what? To finance his wars, his building projects, and yes, his obsession with Anne Boleyn. Because all of this, the break with Rome, the act of supremacy, the dissolution of monasteries, it all traces back to that one decision in 1527 when Henry decided he had to have Anne. Think about the modern parallels here. We've seen leaders justify terrible actions in the name of love, desire, or personal fulfillment. We've seen people rationalize hurting others because it's what I need to be happy. We've seen institutions destroyed, traditions upended, lives ruined, all because someone with power decided their wants were more important than everyone else's needs. That's Henry. That's what this break with Rome really was. Not a principled theological reformation. Martin Luther was doing that in Germany based on actual religious conviction. This was a king rewriting the rules because the old rules didn't give him what he wanted. And the wildest part, it worked. By 1533, Henry had Anne. By 1534, he'd declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. By 1536, he'd made himself incredibly wealthy through the dissolution of monasteries. He'd won. Completely. Totally. But here's what Henry didn't realize yet. What Anne probably didn't realize either. Winning can be more dangerous than losing. Because when you've destroyed everything standing in your way, when you've proven you're willing to execute friends and demolish 1,000-year-old institutions to get what you want, what's to stop you from doing it again? Anne Boleyn was about to find out. Because she'd finally gotten her crown, her title, her position as Queen of England. She'd won the game she'd been playing for 7 years. But the game wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And the same man who'd torn apart England to marry her, he was already starting to wonder if he'd made a mistake. Next up, we're stepping into Anne's moment of triumph. The coronation, the celebration, the peak of her power. But we're also going to see the cracks starting to form, the enemies circling, the pressure mounting. Because being Queen of England sounds glamorous until you realise you're standing on a throne built from broken promises and destroyed lives, and the king who put you there is starting to look at other women. This is where Anne's story shifts from romance to thriller. Stay close. June 1st, 1533, Westminster Abbey. Anne Boleyn is about to be crowned Queen of England, and she's spared absolutely no expense. We're talking about one of the most lavish coronations in Tudor history, a 4-day spectacle designed to tell everyone, I won, I'm here, deal with it. But here's the thing about victory parades. They only work if people are cheering. And when Anne's procession passed through London streets, the silence was deafening. Let me take you through this coronation, because the contrast between the pageantry and the public's reaction tells you everything you need to know about Anne's impossible situation. She'd achieved the unthinkable, gone from merchant's daughter to Queen of England. But she'd made so many enemies along the way that even her moment of triumph felt precarious. The coronation festivities began on May 29th, with Anne's ceremonial journey from Greenwich to the Tower of London by barge. According to Edward Hall's Chronicle, which documented Tudor court events in incredible detail, the river was filled with boats, over 50 decorated barges accompanying the royal vessel. Musicians played, cannons fired salutes. It was meant to be magnificent. Anne wore white cloth of gold, the most expensive fabric available, and her dark hair hung loose down her back, as was traditional for coronation. She was 6 months pregnant, and according to Hall's account, her belly was somewhat big. In other words, visibly pregnant. This was intentional. Henry wanted everyone to see that Anne was carrying what he believed would be his son and heir. On May 31st came the procession through London, the part where Anne would travel from the Tower to Westminster, greeting her new subjects. The city had spent a fortune on decorations. Pageants were staged at various points along the route. Elaborate theatrical presentations with actors, music, and allegorical figures welcoming the new queen. But here's where it gets awkward. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, including a report from the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, the crowds were sparse. And worse, silent. In Tudor England, when the king or queen passed by, people were expected to cheer, to shout, "God save the Queen!" It was automatic. But for Anne, nothing. Chapuis wrote back to Spain that few people showed enthusiasm and many kept their caps on, refusing to remove them as a sign of respect. Can you imagine that? You're sitting in a golden carriage, wearing a fortune in jewels, and the people you're supposed to rule are just staring at you. Or worse, actively ignoring you. That's got to sting. The problem was simple. The English people loved Catherine of Aragon. She'd been their queen for 24 years. She was pious, dignified, charitable. She'd stood by Henry through everything. And now she was being replaced by this French-educated upstart who many saw as nothing more than a homewrecker. The fact that Anne was pregnant before marriage, even though she and Henry had technically married in January, only confirmed what people already thought. She was a seductress who'd manipulated the king. Anne's supporters tried to spin the silent crowds. They said people were overcome with reverence. But that's clearly damage control. The truth is, Anne's coronation revealed just how unpopular she really was. The actual coronation ceremony on June 1st was, by all accounts, magnificent. Anne wore purple velvet trimmed with ermine. Her train was so long it required multiple ladies to carry it. According to Wriothesley's Chronicle, another contemporary account, she was crowned by Thomas Cranmer with St Edward's crown, the same crown used for centuries. Every traditional element was there. Henry was trying to make Anne's queenship as legitimate as possible. But legitimacy and popularity are two different things, and Anne had one without the other. Now here's where Anne's story gets really interesting, because unlike most queens who just smiled, waved, and stayed out of politics, Anne dove in head first, and this is what made her both powerful and dangerous. Historian Eric Ives, whose biography, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn, is basically the definitive academic work on her, describes Anne as intellectually engaged, in a way that was unusual and threatening for women of her time. She didn't just sit by Henry's side looking pretty. She participated in meetings. She gave her opinions on policy. She promoted religious reformers. She read banned books and discussed theology. Anne was a patron of the arts and learning. She employed scholars, musicians, and reformist preachers. According to historian Alison Weir, Anne had a copy of William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament, which was illegal in England at the time. Having an English Bible was considered heresy. And Anne not only owned one, she showed it to Henry, arguing that people should be able to read scripture in their own language. This was radical. This was dangerous. And it made Anne enemies among the conservative Catholic faction at court. Think about it from their perspective. First, this woman convinced the king to break with Rome, destroying their power base in the Catholic Church. Then she got the king to dissolve monasteries, seizing church wealth. And now she's promoting Protestant ideas, pushing England further away from traditional Catholicism. If you were a conservative nobleman who'd built your entire career on the old system, you'd hate Anne Boleyn. And oh, did they hate her. The Spanish faction, led by Ambassador Chapuis, saw Anne as the enemy. Chapuis' dispatches back to Spain, hundreds of them preserved in Spanish archives, are basically a years-long hate campaign against Anne. He called her the concubine. He reported every rumour, every scandal, every piece of gossip that made Anne look bad. He was Catherine's strongest supporter at court, and he would stop at nothing to see Anne destroyed. Then there was the old nobility, families like the Howards, the Seymours, the Poles, who resented the Boleyns' rapid rise. Anne's father had been made Earl of Wiltshire. Her brother George was given important positions. The Boleyns went from merchant class to high nobility in one generation, and that kind of social climbing bred resentment. Even within her own family things were complicated. Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, supported her when it was politically convenient but would later turn against her without hesitation. Family loyalty meant nothing compared to political survival in the Tudor court. So Anne was surrounded by enemies, people who smiled to her face and plotted behind her back, people who couldn't openly defy her because she was the queen, but were waiting for any opportunity to see her fall. And Henry was starting to show the first cracks of doubt. Don't get me wrong, in mid-1533, Henry was still publicly devoted to Anne. He showered her with gifts, gave her jewels that had belonged to Catherine, defended her against critics. But according to Chapuis's reports, there were moments, small things, times when Henry seemed irritated with Anne's outspokenness, times when he'd snap at her or contradict her in front of others. See, here's the psychological trap Henry had built for himself. He'd spent 7 years chasing Anne, 7 years building her up in his mind as this perfect woman who would give him everything Catherine couldn't. But now that the chase was over, now that he'd won the prize, reality was setting in. Anne wasn't perfect. She was human. She had opinions. She argued with him. She could be sharp-tongued, quick-tempered. According to various accounts, including a later testimony from one of her ladies-in-waiting, Anne spoke more arrogantly to the king than any queen before her. She'd say things like, "Queens of England have had their heads cut off before in arguments," which in retrospect is horrifyingly prophetic. But at the time, Anne probably thought she was secure. She was the queen. She was pregnant with Henry's heir. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. But we're not there yet. In the summer and fall of 1533, Anne was at the peak of her power. She had apartments refurbished in every royal palace. She had a household of over 200 people. She influenced appointments, policy decisions, religious reforms. According to historian G.W. Bernard in Anne Boleyn Fatal Attractions, Anne was more politically active than any English queen since Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 1100s. She was also preparing for the birth of her child. Henry had astrologers consult the stars. They all predicted a boy. He had letters prepared announcing the birth of a prince. He commissioned celebrations. He was so certain this child would be male that he had already picked the name Edward. On September 7th, 1533, Anne went into labour at Greenwich Palace. According to the official records, the birth was difficult but successful, and when the child was born, it was a girl. The silence in that birthing chamber must have been devastating. All the planning, all the prophecies, all the certainty, destroyed in an instant. Henry had broken with Rome, executed friends, dissolved monasteries, married Anne, and risked civil war for a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. And while Henry tried to put on a brave face, the disappointment was palpable. The letters announcing a prince had to be hastily modified. Anne's was added to make it prince or princess. The grand celebrations were scaled back. And Anne? According to historian Retha Warnaker in The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, Anne immediately understood the danger she was in. A daughter wasn't enough. She needed a son, quickly. Because here's the brutal truth about Anne's position. She'd been sold to Henry and to England as the solution to the succession crisis. The woman who could give Henry male heirs where Catherine had failed. If she couldn't deliver on that promise, what was her value? The pressure was immense, crushing. Can you imagine? You've just given birth, your body's recovering from a difficult labour, and instead of celebration, there's disappointment. Instead of relief, there's anxiety. Because you absolutely know, that your survival depends on getting pregnant again and having a son, and the clock is ticking. You're in your early 30s, which in Tudor times is already considered risky for childbearing. Every month that passes without a pregnancy is a month your enemies grow bolder. Every day, you're watching your husband for signs that he's losing interest. Every time he looks at another woman, you're wondering if you're about to be replaced just like Catherine was. That's Anne's life now. Queen of England, yes, but also the most precarious position imaginable. One mistake, one failure, one moment of bad luck, and it could all come crashing down. And unfortunately for Anne, luck was about to run out. Because what comes next, what we're about to explore, is a series of tragedies that would seal her fate. Miscarriages that would turn Henry's disappointment into suspicion. Losses that would convince Henry that maybe, just maybe, this marriage was cursed too. Just like his marriage to Catherine had been cursed. History was about to repeat itself. And Anne Boleyn, the woman who'd won the most dangerous game in England, was about to discover that winning and keeping are two very different things. There's a cruel irony in Anne Boleyn's story that I need you to understand. The very thing that got her the crown, the promise of producing a male heir, became the thing that destroyed her. Because Anne could get pregnant, that wasn't the problem. The problem was staying pregnant. And in Tudor England, where people believed in curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment, repeated miscarriages weren't seen as biology. They were seen as a sign that God was angry, a sign that something was very, very wrong. Let me walk you through what happened after Elizabeth's birth, because it's a slow-motion tragedy that unfolds over less than 3 years. 3 years where Anne's body became a battlefield, where every pregnancy brought hope, and every loss brought Henry one step closer to turning against her. After Elizabeth was born in September 1533, Anne did what she was supposed to do. She got pregnant again. Quickly. By early 1534, there are records suggesting Anne was pregnant again. According to historian Rather Warnicke's meticulous analysis of Tudor court records in The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, Anne likely had a miscarriage sometime in the summer of 1534. The records are vague. Miscarriages weren't always documented, especially early ones, but there are hints. References in diplomatic correspondence to Anne being indisposed, mentions of her not appearing at court events, and most tellingly, the sudden absence of any references to an expected child. Now here's what you need to know about Tudor medicine. They understood basically nothing about pregnancy. They believed in the 4 humours, that your health depended on balancing blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. They thought looking at ugly things could mark an unborn child. They believed stress could spoil a pregnancy. In other words, every miscarriage came with a desperate search for what the mothers did wrong, and Anne, smart and well-read as she was, would have been drowning in superstitions and pseudo-medical advice. Don't get upset. Don't ride horses. Don't laugh too hard. Don't eat certain foods. It's suffocating just thinking about it. By late 1534, Anne was pregnant again. This time she made it further. According to the Spanish ambassador Chapuis, who, remember, hated Anne but whose reports are incredibly detailed, Anne was showing signs of pregnancy well into early 1535. But then, sometime in the spring or summer of 1535, that pregnancy also ended. Another loss. Another failure in Henry's eyes. And this is where Henry's psychology becomes really important. Because remember, Henry already went through this with Catherine. Years of watching his first wife have miscarriage after miscarriage. Years of disappointment. And he'd convinced himself that those losses meant his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God. Now it's happening again with Anne. The same pattern. One living child, a daughter, and then multiple losses. Can you imagine what's going through Henry's mind? He's starting to think, wait, is this marriage cursed too? Did I break with Rome, destroy Thomas More, tear apart England's relationship with the Catholic Church for the same problem I had before? That thought is poison, because if this marriage is also cursed, then Henry made a catastrophic mistake. He sacrificed everything for nothing, and Henry's ego couldn't handle that, so he starts looking for someone to blame, and the only person he can blame is Anne. Then came January 29th, 1536, and this is the day everything changed. That morning, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, who'd been living in exile since the annulment, died at Kimbolton Castle. She was 50 years old. According to the official report, she'd been ill for some time. Some historians suspect she was poisoned, though there's no definitive proof. What we do know is that when the news reached Henry, he dressed entirely in yellow and celebrated. Yes, celebrated. According to Chapuis's report, Henry wore yellow from head to toe. Yellow was the colour of celebration in Tudor England, not mourning. He carried baby Elizabeth around court, showing her off. He called for festivities. To Henry, Catherine's death solved a major problem. Now there was no question about his marriage to Anne being legitimate. Catherine was gone. Anne was the only queen. But what Henry saw as liberation, Anne saw as danger. Because according to multiple contemporary accounts, when Anne heard of Catherine's death, she said something chilling. One of her ladies later testified that Anne said, "Now I am indeed a queen." She understood. With Catherine alive, there was always a comparison, a reminder of the legitimate queen that many English people still loved. But with Catherine dead, Anne was alone in the spotlight. All pressure, all blame, all responsibility fell on her shoulders now. And then, just hours after celebrating Catherine's death, Henry had a jousting accident. We need to talk about this accident because it might have changed everything, not just for Anne, but for all of English history. On that same day, January 29th, 1536, Henry was jousting, which he loved despite being in his mid-40s and, let's be honest, not in the best shape anymore. According to eyewitness accounts preserved in the state papers, Henry was thrown from his horse. A horse in full armour fell on top of him. He was unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours! The King of England lying there, potentially dying with no clear male heir. The court was in absolute panic. What if he died? Who would rule? The country could descend into civil war. But Henry woke up, bruised, probably concussed, definitely traumatized, but alive. News of the accident reached Anne, who was pregnant again, about 4 months along at this point, and according to multiple reports, including a later statement from Anne herself, the shock of hearing that Henry might be dead or dying caused her to go into premature labour. On January 29th, the same day as Henry's accident, the same day Catherine died, Anne miscarried, and this time the records are very specific about what she lost. It was a male fetus, advanced enough that the sex was identifiable. A son. Anne had been carrying a son, and she lost him. The timing couldn't have been worse. According to historian John Schofield in The Rise and Fall of Thomas Cromwell, when Henry saw the miscarried fetus, he said to Anne, "I see that God will not give me male children." Then he walked out, just left her there, still recovering from the miscarriage, and walked away. Can you feel the weight of that moment? Everything Anne had worked for, everything she'd risked, everything she'd sacrificed, it all hinged on producing a male heir, and she'd finally been carrying one, only to lose him. And instead of comfort, instead of support, Henry blamed her, blamed God, blamed the universe. But really he was done with her. According to Anne's own later testimony, Henry told her that when she recovered he would speak with her. That phrase, when she recovered he would speak with her, that's Henry. Speak, for I'm planning something. Now let's talk about the medical side of this, because modern science can actually explain what might have been happening. Historian and medical researcher Katrina Banks-Whitley, along with immunologist Kira Kramer, published a fascinating paper in 2010 titled A New Explanation for the Reproductive Woes and Midlife Decline of Henry VIII. They propose that Henry might have had Kell blood type incompatibility. Here's how that works. If Henry was Kell positive and his wives were Kell negative, the first pregnancy would usually be fine. But with each subsequent pregnancy, the mother's immune system would develop antibodies against the Kell positive blood, making it harder and harder to carry a pregnancy to term. The first child survives, like Mary with Catherine, like Elizabeth with Anne, but subsequent pregnancies increasingly result in miscarriage or stillbirth. This would explain why both Catherine and Anne had the same pattern, one successful birth followed by multiple losses. It wasn't a curse, it wasn't God's punishment, it was genetics and immunology. But Tudor doctors didn't know that. They couldn't know that. So instead they looked for supernatural explanations. Another theory, proposed by historian Susanna Lipscomb in 1536, the year that changed Henry VIII, is that Henry's jousting accident in 1536 might have caused a serious brain injury. Traumatic brain injury can cause personality changes, increased aggression, paranoia, mood swings. Some historians argue that Henry after 1536 was a different man. Darker, more paranoid, more dangerous. If true, Anne was dealing with a husband whose brain chemistry had literally changed, but Anne didn't have the luxury of medical explanations. All she had was Henry's cold disappointment and the growing realization that she was running out of chances. And here's where the gender dynamics become really important. Have you ever noticed how in historical accounts of royal reproduction problems, it's always the woman's fault? The queen is barren. The queen failed to produce heirs. Never mind that we now know the father's genetics determine the sex of the child. Never mind that male infertility exists. In Tudor England, if there were no babies or the wrong babies, it was the woman's failure. Anne was trapped in an impossible situation. She needed to get pregnant quickly to prove she could still deliver a son. But the stress of that pressure, the fear of failure, the knowledge that her life depended on her reproductive success, that stress probably made it harder to conceive or carry a pregnancy. It's a vicious cycle. And meanwhile, Henry's eye was wandering. In early 1536, around the time of Anne's final miscarriage, a new woman appeared in the records. Her name was Jane Seymour. And if Anne represented everything bold, sophisticated and French, Jane was the complete opposite. Quiet, demure, obedient, pale-skinned and blonde, the English ideal of beauty that Anne never fit. Jane had been one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Then she became one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. So she'd been there, in the background, watching the drama unfold for years. And according to Ambassador Chapuis, who by the way loved Jane because she supported Catherine's cause, Jane was of middle stature and no great beauty. But she had one quality that Henry suddenly found incredibly attractive. She wasn't Anne. By February 1536, just weeks after Anne's devastating miscarriage, there are records of Henry giving Jane gifts, sending her letters. The pattern was repeating itself exactly. Just as Henry had pursued Anne while married to Catherine, he was now pursuing Jane while married to Anne. Anne noticed. Of course she noticed. According to later testimonies, Anne confronted Henry about Jane. She spoke sharply to women at court she suspected of encouraging Henry's interest in Jane. She was watching her marriage unravel in real time, and there was nothing she could do about it. Think about the psychological torture of this. Your body has just been through traumatic pregnancy loss. You're grieving, you're physically recovering, you're terrified about your future, and your husband is openly flirting with one of your servants, right in front of you, while you're still weak from miscarriage, and you can't even complain about it too loudly, because if you seem too jealous, too sharp-tongued, too difficult, well, that just gives Henry more reason to want Jane's quiet submissiveness instead. Anne was spiralling, and her enemies knew it. They saw the cracks. They saw Henry's wandering eye. They saw their opportunity. Because here's what Anne didn't fully understand yet. She wasn't just competing with Jane Seymour for Henry's affection. She was in a much more dangerous game. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, the man who'd helped Henry break with Rome, who'd helped Henry marry Anne in the first place, was turning against her. Why? Politics. Anne had been pushing for alliances with France. Cromwell wanted alliances with the Holy Roman Empire. Anne had been protecting religious reformers that Cromwell saw as too radical. Their political interests were diverging, and Cromwell, brilliant and ruthless, saw which way the wind was blowing. If Henry wanted out of his marriage to Anne, Cromwell would provide the exit. But unlike with Catherine, where an annulment took 6 years of legal battles, this time it needed to be faster, more final, more permanent. Cromwell started building a case, quietly gathering information, talking to people at court, looking for anything, any rumour, any inappropriate conversation, any moment that could be twisted into evidence. And in April 1536, less than 3 months after Anne's miscarriage, Cromwell would spring his trap. What comes next isn't just divorce. It isn't just an annulment. It's character assassination. It's a manufactured scandal so explosive, so shocking, that it would justify the unthinkable, executing a queen. Anne Boleyn had 3 years as Queen of England, 3 years of power, pressure, and impossible expectations, 3 years where her body became the battlefield for Henry's dynasty. And now, those 3 years were about to end in the most brutal way imaginable. Because the conspiracy against Anne isn't just political manoeuvring, it's a masterclass in how to destroy someone, how to turn allies into enemies, how to make the impossible seem inevitable. We're about to witness how 5 men, 5 innocent men, would be accused alongside Anne of crimes so scandalous that even reading them today makes you go, wait, people believed this? Stay with me. This gets dark. Here's something nobody tells you about being replaced. You usually see it coming. You notice the little changes, the way your partner's attention shifts, the way they compare you to someone else, the way they start finding flaws in things they used to love about you. Anne Boleyn saw it coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jane Seymour wasn't beautiful. Even her supporters admitted that. The Imperial Ambassador Chapuis, who absolutely loved Jane because she supported Catherine of Aragon's cause, described her as of middle stature and no great beauty. Another contemporary account calls her pale and unimpressive. But you know what Jane had that Anne didn't anymore? Novelty, mystery, the promise of something different. And for Henry VIII, who collected wives like some people collect stamps, different was irresistible. Let me tell you about Jane, because understanding her strategy, whether it was calculated or just her natural personality, is key to understanding how quickly Anne's world collapsed. Jane Seymour came from a respectable, but not particularly powerful family. The Seymours were minor gentry from Wiltshire. Solid, unremarkable, thoroughly English. Jane was born around 1508, which made her about 27 or 28 when Henry's attention landed on her in early 1536. She'd served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and then Anne Boleyn. So Jane had been there, in the background, watching both queens up close. She'd seen what worked and what didn't. She'd seen Catherine's dignity and defeat. She'd seen Anne's boldness and where it led. And Jane learned from both of them. According to historian David Starkey in 6 Wives, the Queens of Henry VIII, Jane's strategy, whether conscious or not, was to be everything Anne wasn't. Where Anne was dark-haired, Jane was fair. Where Anne was educated and opinionated, Jane appeared modest and quiet. Where Anne argued with Henry, Jane agreed. Where Anne pushed for religious reform, Jane quietly supported traditional Catholicism. It was brilliant, really, because Henry was exhausted from arguments, from disappointment, from a wife who challenged him. Jane represented peace, simplicity, a return to the way things used to be. But here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. Henry had a pattern, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. With Catherine, he'd been married for 18 years before he started pursuing Anne seriously, but he'd had mistresses throughout that marriage. Then came Anne. He chased her for 7 years, married her, and within 3 years was pursuing Jane. The intervals were getting shorter, the dissatisfaction was coming faster. This tells us something crucial about Henry's psychology. The man was incapable of contentment. There was always a next thing he needed to be happy, a next wife, a next son, a next conquest. And the tragic irony is that the women in his life paid the price for his inability to be satisfied. In February 1536, just weeks after Anne's miscarriage, courtiers started noticing Henry's attention shifting to Jane. According to the Spanish Chronicles, a collection of eyewitness accounts compiled by an anonymous Spanish merchant living in London, Henry began sending Jane gifts and letters. He gave her a locket with his portrait inside. Very romantic, very familiar. It was exactly what he'd done with Anne years earlier. And Jane's response? She sent the locket back unopened. Wait, what? Yeah. According to Chapuis's report, when Henry sent Jane a purse of gold coins and a letter, Jane returned both, saying she couldn't accept such gift from a married man. She even had the audacity to suggest that if Henry wanted to give her gold, perhaps he could give it as part of her dowry when she made an advantageous marriage. Bold, right? Except here's the thing. This was Anne's playbook. Reject the king's advances. Make him work for it. Create scarcity. Except Jane added a twist. She positioned herself as morally pure. Unlike Anne, who'd held out for queenship but everyone knew was strategically ambitious, Jane held out and made it seem like virtue. Like she was protecting her honour, not playing a game. And Henry fell for it completely. Because he'd forgotten what it felt like to be told no. Anne had stopped saying no years ago. She was his wife now, available, familiar. But Jane was the chase again, the excitement, the fantasy. Now, imagine being Anne during this. You're still recovering physically and emotionally from a devastating miscarriage. Your husband, who you destroyed a kingdom to marry, is openly courting one of your own servants. And you can't even complain too loudly because that makes you seem like the problem. According to testimony later given by several of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, documented in the state papers at the National Archives, Anne became increasingly erratic in early 1536. She'd fly into rages, she'd cry, she'd confront Henry about Jane, she'd snap at women at court she suspected of encouraging the relationship. There's one incident that really captures Anne's desperation. In March 1536, Anne found Jane sitting on Henry's lap. Literally, in one of the royal apartments, and Anne completely lost it. According to the account preserved by chronicler Edward Hall, Anne burst into the room and used such words to her that Jane burst into tears and fled. Henry was furious at Anne for making a scene, not at Jane for the inappropriate behaviour, at Anne for reacting. This is gaslighting on a royal scale. Anne's watching her marriage disintegrate, her husband actively pursuing someone else, and when she objects, she's told she's being unreasonable, hysterical, difficult. Have any of you experienced something like that? Where you're reacting to something genuinely hurtful, but somehow you become the villain for reacting. It's crazy making, and Anne was living it every single day, with the added pressure that her life literally depended on staying in Henry's good graces. But here's what Anne didn't fully realise yet. This wasn't just about Jane. Jane was a symptom, not the cause. The real danger was coming from someone Anne thought was her ally, Thomas Cromwell. Let's talk about Cromwell, because his betrayal of Anne is one of the most calculated political murders in history. Thomas Cromwell was a blacksmith's son who'd clawed his way to the top through pure intelligence and ruthlessness. According to historian Diarmaid MacCulloch's biography, Thomas Cromwell: A Revolutionary Life, Cromwell had spent time as a mercenary, a merchant, a lawyer. He'd seen every level of society and knew how to manipulate all of them. Cromwell had been instrumental in breaking England from Rome. He'd engineered the dissolution of the monasteries. He'd helped Henry marry Anne in the first place. By all accounts, he and Anne should have been natural allies. They were both reformers, both pushing England toward Protestantism, both benefiting from the new order Henry had created. But by early 1536, their interests had diverged. Badly. Anne was pushing for an alliance with France. Cromwell wanted an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, specifically with Charles V, who, ironically, was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Anne was protecting radical reformers that Cromwell thought were too extreme and politically dangerous. Anne had opinions about policy and wasn't shy about expressing them, which threatened Cromwell's position as Henry's chief advisor. Most importantly, Cromwell could read the room. He saw Henry's interest in Jane. He saw Anne's multiple miscarriages. He saw that Henry was looking for an exit from this marriage. And Cromwell, brilliant strategist that he was, decided to get ahead of the curve. According to historian G.W. Bernard in The King's Reformation, Cromwell understood something crucial. If Anne fell, he needed to be the one who pushed her, not someone who got caught in her collapse. Because if he'd stayed loyal to Anne and she fell anyway, he'd fall with her. But if he orchestrated her downfall, he'd be indispensable to Henry. So Cromwell made a choice. A cold, calculated, absolutely ruthless choice. He would destroy Anne Boleyn. But here's the problem. You can't just execute a queen because the king is bored with her. You need cause, legal justification, something so shocking, so unforgivable, that executing a queen seems not just acceptable but necessary. And Cromwell, with his legal mind and his network of spies and informants throughout the court, started building exactly that. In April 1536, Cromwell began interrogating people, members of Anne's household, musicians, servants, anyone who'd been close to the Queen. According to the surviving records from these interrogations held in the National Archives, Cromwell was looking for anything. Any inappropriate comment, any moment of familiarity between Anne and any man at court, any joke, any conversation, any interaction that could be twisted into something darker. And he found it. Or rather, he manufactured it. See, here's how court life worked in the 1500s. It was formal, but also surprisingly casual. The Queen would be surrounded by male courtiers constantly. They'd dance together, talk, exchange gifts, write poetry. This was a normal courtly behaviour, part of the elaborate game of courtly love that has been standard in European courts for centuries. But Cromwell took these normal interactions and twisted them. A dance became evidence of flirtation. A conversation became a secret meeting. A gift of poetry became proof of an affair. Think about how dangerous this is. Cromwell was essentially saying that any woman who'd ever had a friendly interaction with a man was potentially guilty of adultery. By this logic, every woman at court was in danger. But Cromwell wasn't targeting every woman. He was targeting Anne. And he was building a case so explosive that when it finally broke, it would shock even the jaded Tudor court. The charges Cromwell was constructing weren't just about adultery, though that alone was treason for a queen, since it threatened the legitimacy of her children. No, Cromwell went further. He was preparing to accuse Anne of multiple affairs, with multiple men, including, and this is where it gets absolutely sick, her own brother. Incest. That was the charge Cromwell was preparing. Because if adultery made people uncomfortable, incest made them recoil in horror. It was the kind of accusation that dehumanized Anne completely. That made her seem not just unfaithful, but monstrous, unnatural, evil. And the brilliant, terrible thing about Cromwell's strategy. Once you accuse someone of something that horrific, it doesn't matter if it's true. The accusation itself does the damage. People start looking at Anne differently, questioning everything, wondering if maybe, possibly, there was something wrong with her all along. This is character assassination at its finest, and it's frighteningly relevant today, isn't it? How many times have we seen someone, usually a powerful woman, destroyed not by what they actually did, but by accusations so scandalous that the truth becomes irrelevant? The allegation becomes the story. By late April 1536, Cromwell had his targets. 5 men who would be accused alongside Anne: Mark Smeaton, a court musician, low-born, talented, completely dependent on the Queen's patronage; Henry Norris, the King's close friend and groom of the stool, one of the most trusted men at court; William Brereton, a powerful courtier with enemies who'd welcome his fall; Francis Weston, a young courtier known for his charm; and George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's own brother. None of these men had actually done anything, but Cromwell didn't need reality. He needed confessions. He needed testimony. He needed a narrative that would justify the unjustifiable, and he was about to get it through a combination of torture, threats, and broken men who'd say anything to stop the pain. What happens next isn't just the fall of a queen. It's a masterclass in how to destroy someone, how to turn loyalty into betrayal, how to make innocent people confess to crimes they didn't commit, how to manufacture a scandal so convincing that 500 years later, some people still wonder if maybe there was some truth to it. Spoiler alert, there wasn't. What's about to happen is one of the most sophisticated frame jobs in history, and we're about to watch it unfold step by terrible step until Anne Boleyn goes from Queen of England to condemned prisoner in just 19 days. 19 days! That's all it took to destroy her. Let's see how Cromwell did it. 19 days. That's how long it took to destroy Anne Boleyn. From Queen of England, surrounded by servants and power, to a condemned prisoner waiting to die. 19 days in late April and early May 1536 that would become one of the most efficient character assassinations in history. And it all started with a musician who couldn't handle being interrogated. April 30th, 1536. Thomas Cromwell's men arrested Mark Smeaton at his home in London. Mark was a court musician, a talented one by all accounts. He played the virginals and was part of Anne's household entertainment, but more importantly he was lowborn. No powerful family to protect him, no connections to save him. Just a young man who'd risen through talent and was now utterly vulnerable. According to the surviving interrogation records, preserved in the state papers at the National Archives, Mark was taken to Cromwell's house at Stepney, not to the Tower, not to any official location, to Cromwell's private residence. And what happened there over the next several hours changed everything. We don't have a complete record of Mark's interrogation, but we have enough. Historian Alison Weir in The Lady in the Tower pieces together the evidence. Mark was interrogated for hours. Some accounts suggest he was tortured, possibly with a knotted rope twisted around his head, a torture device that caused excruciating pain without leaving obvious marks. Others suggest the torture was psychological. Threats about what would happen if he didn't cooperate, promises of mercy if he did. Either way, by the end of that day, Mark Smeaton confessed. He admitted to having a sexual relationship with Queen Anne, and just like that, Cromwell had his first domino, his first piece of evidence, his first crack in the foundation. Now, here's what you need to understand about confessions in the Tudor era. They were everything. Once someone confessed, that confession could be used against others. It could be leveraged, expanded, twisted into whatever narrative was needed. And Mark's confession, whether true or coerced, gave Cromwell exactly what he needed to move forward. On May 1st, 1536, there was a joust at Greenwich. Anne was there, sitting in the royal box watching. Henry was there too, participating in the tournament. Everything seemed normal. But according to eyewitness accounts, including one from the imperial ambassador Chapuis, something strange happened. Henry suddenly stood up, left the joust without explanation, and rode off to Westminster with only 6 attendants. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. Anne was left sitting there, confused, probably terrified because by now she must have sensed something was wrong. That night, while Anne was sleeping at Greenwich Palace, several men were arrested. Henry Norris, the king's close friend and groom of the stool, Francis Weston, a young courtier, William Brereton, a powerful Welsh courtier who had enemies. These weren't random arrests. These were targeted takedowns of men close to Anne, men who'd been friendly with her, men who'd played the normal games of courtly love. According to historian Eric Ives in The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn, the speed of these arrests suggests Cromwell had been planning this for weeks. He had a list. He had targets. He was just waiting for the right moment to strike. May 2nd, 1536. Anne was at Greenwich, probably still trying to figure out what was happening. Around midday, members of the Privy Council arrived. They informed Anne that she was being arrested on charges of adultery, treason, and conspiracy to murder the king. Wait, conspiracy to murder the king? Yeah, that's how absurd these charges were. Cromwell wasn't just accusing Anne of having affairs. He was claiming she'd plotted with her lovers to kill Henry so she could marry one of them and rule England. According to the account by Constable of the Tower William Kingston, who documented Anne's imprisonment in letters to Cromwell, Anne's reaction was shock and then hysteria. She asked, "Where are they accusing me of?" She laughed, probably from shock. She cried. She kept talking, asking questions, defending herself even though no one was listening. Anne was taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same tower where she'd stayed before her coronation, where she'd been treated like royalty. Now she was entering as a prisoner, and according to Kingston's letters, when Anne saw the tower, she fell to her knees and said, "Jesus, have mercy on me." Then she asked Kingston, "Shall I die without justice?" And Kingston, trying to comfort her, said the king was too good to let injustice happen. Anne's response, "If any man accuse me, I can say no more but nay, without I should open my body." She was saying, how can I prove a negative? How do you prove you didn't do something? That's the brilliance of Cromwell's strategy. The charges were unfalsifiable. How do you prove you didn't have an affair? How do you prove conversations were innocent? You can't. The mere accusation becomes the evidence. Over the next few days, more arrests came. On May 4th, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, was arrested and taken to the Tower. The charge? Incest. Cromwell was accusing Anne of having a sexual relationship with her own brother. Let me be very clear about this. There is zero evidence this happened. Zero. Every historian who studied this case, from Eric Ives to Alison Weir to David Starkey to Ratha Warneke, agrees that the incest charge was fabricated. But Cromwell included it because incest was so shocking, so disgusting, that it would make Anne seem monstrous. It would dehumanize her completely. Think about the strategy here. If you want to destroy someone, you don't just accuse them of breaking rules. You accuse them of breaking fundamental moral taboos. You make them seem so evil that normal people can't even imagine defending them. We see this today, don't we? In cancel culture, in political smear campaigns, in social media pile-ons. The accusation doesn't have to be true, it just has to be horrifying enough that people's first instinct is to distance themselves from the accused. Now let's talk about the specific charges because they're ridiculous once you actually examine them. According to the indictments, which survive in the National Archives, Anne was accused of committing adultery with these 5 men on specific dates, and this is where the case falls apart. For example, Anne was accused of committing adultery with Mark Smeaton on May 13th, 1535 at Greenwich. But court records show Anne was actually at Richmond Palace on that date, not Greenwich. She literally couldn't have been in both places. She was accused of sleeping with Henry Norris on October 12, 1533. But on that date, Anne had just given birth to Elizabeth less than 5 weeks earlier. She would have still been in confinement, a mandatory isolation period after childbirth where the Queen didn't see men, including the King. It was physically impossible. Historian G.W. Bernard, in his book Anne Boleyn Fatal Attractions, went through every single date in the indictment and found similar impossibilities. Anne was either in a different location or in confinement, or publicly documented as being somewhere else with dozens of witnesses. The timeline didn't work. The logistics didn't work. The whole case was fiction. But Cromwell didn't need the truth. He needed something that sounded plausible enough to justify a guilty verdict. And in the Tudor legal system, once someone was charged with treason, the verdict was basically predetermined. The trial was theatre, not justice. Meanwhile, in the Tower, Anne was falling apart. According to Kingston's letters to Cromwell, and these letters are fascinating because Kingston clearly feels some sympathy for Anne, she alternated between defending herself, joking nervously, crying, and talking non-stop. She was trying to make sense of something that made no sense. In one letter, Kingston describes Anne saying, "I hear say, I shall be accused with 3 men, and I can say no more but nay, without I should open my body." Then she laughed. "O Norris, hast thou accused me? Thou art in the Tower with me, and thou and I shall die together." She was processing the absurdity of it all. She also said something that breaks my heart every time I read it. According to Kingston, Anne said, "The King's grace hath been very good to me. He promoted me from a simple maid to be a marchioness. Then he raised me to be a queen. Now he will raise me to be a martyr." She understood. She knew this was Henry's doing. She knew the charges were false, but she also knew it didn't matter. The other accused men were being interrogated separately. Henry Norris, the King's best friend, refused to confess. Even when promised mercy, even when threatened, he maintained his innocence. According to the records, Norris told his interrogators, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than accuse the Queen of something she didn't do." That's courage. That's integrity. and it cost him his life. William Brereton also refused to confess. Francis Weston denied everything. Even George Boleyn, Anne's brother, forcefully denied the incest charge. These were men facing execution, and they wouldn't lie to save themselves. Only Mark Smeaton's confession stood, and historians have debated for centuries whether Mark was tortured into confessing, or whether maybe he'd actually had feelings for Anne, and under pressure created a fantasy relationship in his mind. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that his confession, the only confession, became the linchpin of the entire case. On May 10th, 1536, 12 men were put on trial at Westminster. Not Anne or George, they'd be tried separately because they were nobility, but the 4 commoners, Smeaton, Norris, Weston and Brereton. The trial lasted 1 day. The verdict was predetermined. All 4 were found guilty of treason. Sleeping with the Queen was treasonous because it threatened the legitimacy of her children and thus the royal succession. The sentence: death. According to eyewitness accounts, when the verdicts were read, Mark Smeaton looked devastated. He'd confessed hoping for mercy, probably promised that cooperation would save his life. Now he realized he'd been used. His confession had condemned not just himself but 4 other men, and Anne. 3 days later, on May 13th, Anne and George were put on trial separately. We're going to dive deep into Anne's trial in just a moment, because it's one of the most unjust legal proceedings in English history. But I want you to understand what happened in those days between the arrests and the trials. In less than 2 weeks, Cromwell had arrested 6 people, extracted 1 confession, built an entire case around that confession, held trials, and secured guilty verdicts. It was assembly line justice, factory-produced convictions. It was efficient, brutal, and completely corrupt. And Henry? Where was Henry during all this? According to Chapuis's reports, Henry was spending time with Jane Seymour. He'd moved her into royal apartments. He was planning their wedding. While Anne was in the Tower, terrified and alone, while men were being tried for their lives based on fabricated charges, Henry was courting his next wife. On May 12th, 1536, the day before Anne's trial, Chapuis reported that Henry was in the highest spirits and was discussing with Jane how many children they'd have. Henry had completely moved on. In his mind, Anne was already dead. The trial was just a formality, and that tells you everything about Henry's character at this point. This wasn't a king agonizing over a difficult decision. This wasn't a man torn between love and duty. This was a narcissist who decided he wanted something else and was watching his staff clean up the mess. The men being executed. The woman he'd destroyed England to marry. They were just obstacles he'd moved past. Have you ever dealt with someone who just erases you? Someone who makes you feel like everything you shared, everything you went through together, never meant anything? That's what Henry did to Anne. He erased her while she was still alive, and Anne, sitting in the Tower, knew exactly what was coming. The trials were scheduled, the verdicts were foregone conclusions. All that remained was the performance, the public ritual of pretending this was justice when everyone involved knew it was murder. What comes next is Anne standing trial before a jury of men who already wanted her dead. We're going to watch her defend herself with dignity and intelligence, knowing that nothing she says will matter. We're going to hear the charges read aloud, including the incest accusation that made even hardened Tudor courtiers uncomfortable. And we're going to witness how easily justice can be corrupted when power decides someone needs to be destroyed. Because if this can happen to a queen, someone with resources, intelligence, a platform to defend herself, imagine how easily it happens to people with no power at all. Stay with me. This is where Anne shows us who she really was. May 15th, 1536. The Great Hall at the Tower of London has been transformed into a courtroom. About 2,000 people have packed in to watch. This is the trial of the century, after all. The Queen of England accused of adultery and treason. It's the kind of scandal that would dominate Twitter for weeks if social media existed. But here's what everyone in that room already knows. The verdict is decided. Anne Boleyn will be found guilty. The trial is just theatre, a performance of justice to make the execution seem legitimate. Anne was brought into the hall around 9 a.m. According to eyewitness accounts from the Imperial Ambassador Chapuis and French diplomat Lancelot de Carle, who were both present, Anne looked pale but composed. She was dressed in black, fitting for what was essentially her funeral. She walked with her head high, and according to de Carle's later written account, she showed such constancy that everyone was amazed. The court was presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Let that sink in. Her uncle was leading the prosecution against her, and sitting as judges were 26 peers, nobles who would decide her fate. Among them was Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. Remember him? He was Anne's first love, the man she'd wanted to marry before her family forced them apart. Now he was judging whether she'd live or die. Can you imagine the emotional weight in that room? Anne, looking at faces she knew, men she'd danced with, talked to, laughed with at court. Men who owed their positions partly to her influence, and now they were sitting in judgment, knowing exactly what verdict was expected of them. The charges were read aloud. According to the indictment preserved in the National Archives, Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, conspiracy to murder the king, and, this is where it gets truly vile, following daily her frail and carnal appetites, and having a heart and mind to compass and imagine the death of the king. That language, frail and carnal appetites, was designed to paint Anne as a sex-crazed woman controlled by lust. It played into every misogynistic stereotype about women being unable to control their desires. It was slut-shaming on a royal scale. Then came the incest charge involving her brother George. When that was read, according to Chapuis' report, even some of the hardened nobles in the room looked uncomfortable. Incest was so taboo that accusing someone of it was almost unthinkable. But Cromwell knew what he was doing. He needed Anne to seem not just guilty, but monstrous. Anne was allowed to respond, and this is where she showed her intelligence and courage. According to multiple accounts, including the detailed chronicle by Edward Hall, Anne defended herself so well, making such wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, that if the verdict hadn't been predetermined, she might have won. She denied every charge, systematically, calmly. She pointed out inconsistencies in the dates, how she couldn't have been in 2 places at once. She explained that the conversations with these men had been innocent courtly exchanges, nothing more. She addressed the incest charge with particular force, calling it a false accusation. According to historian Eric Ives, who analysed the trial records extensively, Anne's defence was brilliant. She didn't just deny guilt, she demonstrated the absurdity of the charges. She showed how normal court interactions had been twisted into something sinister. But it didn't matter. The jury had their orders. There's one moment from the trial that really captures the injustice of it all. When the evidence against Anne was presented, the main proof was Mark Smeaton's confession. That's it. One coerced confession from a tortured musician. No letters, no witnesses to actual adultery, no physical evidence. Just one confession and a lot of innuendo about conversations and glances. Anne pointed this out. According to de Carle's account, she said something to the effect of, You have no proof beyond one man's word extracted under duress. She was essentially arguing that the case was built on nothing, which it was. But the Tudor legal system didn't require proof beyond reasonable doubt. For treason, especially, the mere accusation from the king's representatives was often enough, and this wasn't really a trial, it was a rubber stamp. After Anne's defence, the jury retired to deliberate. This didn't take long. According to the records, they were gone for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood up. It was Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. His job was to announce the verdict. Guilty. Every single judge voted guilty. All 26. According to Chapuis, several of the judges wept as they gave their verdict. Henry Percy, Anne's first love, actually collapsed and had to be carried out. But they all voted guilty anyway. Why? Because voting not guilty would mean opposing the king's will. And in Tudor England, opposing Henry VIII's will could get you executed too. These judges weren't evaluating evidence. They were protecting themselves. After the verdict, Norfolk had to announce the sentence. This was customary for treason. The condemned would be told exactly how they'd die. And for women convicted of treason, the punishment was burning at the stake. Norfolk pronounced, "Thou shalt be burned here within the Tower of London on the Green, else to have thy head smitten off as the king's pleasure shall be further known." Burned alive or beheaded, Henry's choice. Anne listened to her death sentence delivered by her own uncle and, according to witnesses, didn't flinch. She simply said, "O Father, O Creator, thou who art the way, the life, and the truth, knowest whether I have deserved this death." Then she added something that shows her sharp mind even in this moment. "My lords, I will not say your sentence is unjust, nor presume that my reasons can prevail against your convictions. I am prepared to die, but I am innocent of the charges. I have always been a faithful wife to the king. If he is set on having a new wife, I wish her well. I don't envy her the crown she will take from me." That last line is savage, isn't it? I don't envy her. Anne knew that being Henry's wife was a death sentence. She'd seen it with Catherine. Now she was living it. And she was warning Jane Seymour, without naming her, that the crown came with a price. Anne was taken back to her lodgings in the Tower. According to Constable Kingston's letters, as she left the courtroom, she said, "I have heard many speak against me since I came here, but none can bring proof against me. All I can say is that I am clear before God of the offences laid to my charge." That same day, her brother George was tried separately. George's trial was even more of a sham than Anne's. The incest charge was so thin that Cromwell had to resort to truly desperate tactics. According to historian Alison Weir in The Lady in the Tower, George was handed a piece of paper during his trial and told not to read it aloud. The paper allegedly contained a question about whether Anne had said the king was impotent. This was a trap. If George read it aloud, he'd be guilty of spreading rumours about the king. If he didn't read it, he'd be guilty of not defending himself against the accusation. George, with characteristic boldness, read it aloud anyway. He said his sister had never said such a thing. But the damage was done. The rumour was now public. And the jury, the same 26 men who just convicted Anne, immediately found George guilty too. The sentence was the same: death. But for men, the execution was different. George would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. One of the most brutal execution methods imaginable, though Henry later mercifully commuted this to beheading. So now we have 6 people condemned to die, 5 men and 1 woman, all convicted on the flimsiest evidence imaginable. All condemned because it served Henry's political interest to be rid of Anne. On May 17th, 1536, 2 days after the trial, the 5 men were executed. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn were all beheaded on Tower Hill. According to eyewitness accounts, each man was allowed to make a final speech. Henry Norris maintained his innocence, but, following Tudor custom, praised the king. William Brereton did the same. Francis Weston used his final moments to warn the crowd against the temptations of court life. A poignant message from a young man about to die for crimes he didn't commit. George Boleyn's speech was longer. According to the account preserved by chronicler Charles Ruthsley, George admitted to being a sinner, referencing his own marital infidelities and general moral failings, but he never admitted to incest or to conspiring against the king. He was confessing to being human while maintaining his innocence of the actual charges. Only Mark Smeaton, the musician whose confession had started this nightmare, admitted guilt. He said, "Masters all, I pray you all pray for me, for I have deserved the death." Whether this was genuine guilt or just the broken words of a tortured man, we'll never know. All 5 men were beheaded in one morning. Their heads were displayed on spikes on London Bridge as a warning. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, and just like that, 5 lives were erased. Anne watched from her window in the tower as the execution preparations happened. She couldn't see the actual executions, but she knew. She knew her brother was dead. She knew the other men were dead. And she knew she was next. According to Kingston's letters to Cromwell, Anne was expecting to die on May 18th. She kept asking when the execution would happen. She was ready. She'd prepared herself mentally and spiritually. But then Henry did something interesting. He delayed it. Why? Because he needed Archbishop Cranmer to officially annul his marriage to Anne first. Yes, you read that right. Henry was executing Anne for adultery while simultaneously arguing their marriage had never been valid. The logic doesn't work. If the marriage wasn't valid, how could she commit adultery against it? But logic wasn't Henry's concern. Legal convenience was. On May 17th, Cranmer arrived at the Tower and met with Anne privately. According to Cranmer's own later account, he convinced Anne to agree to the annulment. In exchange, he promised her that Elizabeth would be taken care of. Anne, knowing she was about to die anyway, agreed. The marriage was declared null and void. This meant Elizabeth was now illegitimate, just like Mary, Catherine's daughter, had been declared illegitimate. Both of Henry's daughters were now officially bastards. Neither could inherit the throne. Henry had destroyed his own succession, all to marry Jane Seymour with a clean slate. The annulment also created a bizarre situation. Anne was being executed for adultery in a marriage that legally never existed. Think about that. It's like getting convicted of fraud in a transaction that was later declared illegal. The charges contradicted the annulment. But again, nobody cared about consistency. They cared about what Henry wanted. Anne spent her final days in the Tower with several ladies-in-waiting, women assigned to watch her and report everything she said. According to their testimonies, Anne alternated between calm acceptance and moments of dark humour. At one point she put her hands around her neck and laughed, saying, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." She was joking about her own execution. That's either remarkable courage or complete denial. Probably both. She also spent hours in prayer. According to Kingston, Anne took communion and swore on the consecrated host, the most sacred oath possible for a Catholic, that she was innocent. She said, "I am as clear from the company of man as for sin, as I am clear from you all." This is important. Anne was facing death, moments away from meeting God according to her beliefs, and she swore her innocence on the sacrament. If she was lying, she believed she'd be damned eternally. The fact that she did this tells us she was telling the truth. By May 18th, Anne thought she'd die that day. She kept asking Kingston, "When will I die?" Kingston didn't know. Henry kept changing the date. Finally, the execution was scheduled for May 19th at 9 a.m. But even that would be delayed. Anne had one more night to sit in her rooms, knowing that in hours she'd be dead. One more night to think about her daughter Elizabeth, only 2.5 years old. One more night to reflect on how she'd gone from nobody to queen to condemned prisoner in less than a decade. Have you ever had a night where you couldn't sleep because you were anxious about something? An interview, a medical test, a difficult conversation? Now multiply that anxiety by infinity. That's what Anne faced. But here's what's remarkable. According to every account, Anne never completely broke. She was scared. Of course she was. But she maintained her dignity. She planned her final speech carefully. She chose her clothes. She prepared to die as a queen, not as a broken woman. And when the morning of May 19th finally came, when they told her the executioner was ready, Anne stood up, walked to her death, and did something that 500 years later still gives me chills. She gave a speech that was simultaneously graceful, strategic, and heartbreaking. A speech that protected her daughter while maintaining her innocence. A speech that showed Henry and all of England exactly what they were destroying. We're about to witness Anne Boleyn's final moments. Not just her death, but how she faced it. How she controlled the one thing she had left. Her narrative, her last words, her final act of defiance disguised as submission. This is where Anne stops being a victim and becomes a martyr. Let's step onto that scaffold with her. May 19th, 1536. The morning is cool and overcast. Inside her rooms at the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn is preparing to die. She's wearing a grey damask gown with a red petticoat underneath. Red, the colour of martyrdom. Or maybe just the practical choice because it won't show blood. Over her dress, she wears a white ermine cape, the symbol of royalty. Even facing death, Anne is making a statement. I am a queen. Her dark hair is pinned up, tucked under a simple white coif, a linen cap. Around her neck, nothing. Yet. According to Constable Kingston's final letter to Cromwell, Anne woke early that morning, around 2 a.m, and asked him to come to her chamber. When he arrived, she said something that shows her remarkable composure. Master Kingston, I hear I shall not die afore noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time and past my pain. She was sorry the execution was delayed. She wanted it over with. The waiting was torture. Kingston assured her it would be quick and painless. The French swordsman Henry had hired was the best. Anne replied, and this line is famous, I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. Then she put her hands around her throat and laughed. Kingston later wrote that he'd never seen anyone so cheerful facing death. But was it cheerfulness, or was it shock? Gallows humour in its most literal sense. Around 8 a.m, Anne heard that the execution was again delayed. Why? Because Henry was waiting for official confirmation that the annulment was complete. He wanted every legal box checked before killing his wife, the bureaucracy of murder. Anne spent the extra time in prayer. According to the ladies who were with her, she took communion again and repeated her oath of innocence. She asked them to pray for the king and to acknowledge him as a good and gracious sovereign. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. This was strategy. Anne knew that her daughter Elizabeth's future depended on Henry's mercy. If Anne cursed Henry publicly, Elizabeth would pay the price. Finally, around 11 a.m, Kingston came to Anne's room and told her it was time. According to French poet Lancelot de Carle, who later compiled eyewitness accounts, Anne stood up calmly, distributed small gifts to her ladies, a prayer book, some coins, personal items, and said, "Pray for me." Then she walked out of her rooms for the last time. The execution site was on Tower Green, a private area within the tower walls, not the public execution site on Tower Hill where the 5 men had died. This was a mercy, sort of. Anne's death would be witnessed by maybe 1,000 people instead of tens of thousands. The crowd included government officials, foreign ambassadors, and various nobility who'd been invited or commanded to attend. A wooden scaffold had been erected, about 4 feet high, draped with black cloth. In the centre sat a block of wood, though not the traditional chopping block. This was lower, flatter. The French swordsman, who'd been brought from Calais specifically for this execution, would execute Anne while she was kneeling, not lying down. The sword would come from the side, not from above. It was supposed to be faster, cleaner, more merciful than an axe. As Anne walked toward the scaffold, according to multiple eyewitness accounts preserved in letters and chronicles, she looked composed. "Her face was cheerful," wrote one observer. Another said she walked with great dignity. The imperial ambassador Chapuis, who hated Anne but witnessed the execution, reported that she showed greater willingness to die than she had ever showed to live. Anne climbed the steps to the scaffold. Standing there, elevated above the crowd, she could see faces she recognized. Cromwell was there, the man who'd orchestrated her death, the Duke of Suffolk, Henry's close friend who'd always disliked her, various nobles who'd attended her coronation just 3 years earlier. Now they'd come to watch her die. Anne looked at them all, and then she gave her final speech. Now, here's what you need to understand about final speeches in Tudor executions. They were expected to follow a formula. The condemned was supposed to admit they deserved death, even if innocent, praise the king and ask for mercy for their soul, warn the crowd against sin, accept their fate as God's will. This formula existed because anything else, any accusation against the king, any proclamation of innocence, would endanger the condemned's family. So even innocent people followed the script. But Anne, brilliant strategist that she was, found a way to work within the formula while still proclaiming her innocence. Let me read you her speech, reconstructed from multiple sources including Chapuis's dispatch, the Portuguese account, and Edward Hall's chronicle. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." Pause there. She's praising Henry, calling him gentle and merciful while he's literally executing her. That's the required formula. But notice what she's also doing. She's saying according to the law and by the law, emphasizing that this is legal murder. She's saying she won't speak of that whereof I am accused, which implies there's something to say, but she's choosing not to. It's subtle defiance wrapped in submission. She continued, "And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. Judge the best." That's Anne asking people to think critically about what happened, to use their judgment. She's not directly proclaiming innocence, that would endanger Elizabeth, but she's planting a seed of doubt. Then she said, "O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." And she repeated in English and then in Latin, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." According to multiple accounts, Anne's voice never wavered. She spoke clearly, loudly enough for the crowd to hear. She looked people in the eyes. She was playing her final role, the tragic queen, with perfect composure. After her speech, Anne removed her ermine cape and her coif. Her ladies helped her tuck all her hair under a white cap so her neck was completely bare. One of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes, a white cloth. Anne was now kneeling, blindfolded, waiting. Here's a detail that's haunted me since I first read about it. Anne kept moving her head, looking around even though she was blindfolded, probably trying to anticipate where the blow would come from, probably terrified despite her composed exterior. The executioner saw this, and he did something kind. He called out to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." There was no assistant. It was a trick, a distraction. The moment Anne turned her head toward the voice, the executioner swung. According to all witnesses, it happened in an instant. One clean strike. Anne's head was severed completely. Her lips were seen moving in prayer even after, though this was almost certainly just muscle spasms. The crowd stood in shocked silence. The executioner picked up Anne's head and held it up, as was customary, saying, "So perish all the king's enemies." But according to Chapuis's report, he said it with a troubled and hesitant voice. Anne's body remained on the scaffold while an old elm arrow chest was found to serve as a coffin. They hadn't even prepared a proper coffin for the Queen of England. Her ladies wrapped her body and head in white cloth and placed them in the chest. Then Anne was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls. No ceremony, no marker, just an arrow chest buried in the church floor. She was 33 years old. Well, approximately. We don't know her exact birth year, but somewhere between 33 and 36. Young, vibrant, gone. And where was Henry during all this? I wish I could tell you he was agonizing somewhere, troubled by what he'd done. But no. According to multiple sources, including Chapuis's detailed dispatch, Henry spent the morning of Anne's execution at a manor house in Wiltshire with Jane Seymour. When news reached him that Anne was dead, he dressed entirely in white, his mourning colour, and immediately announced his betrothal to Jane. The next day, May 20th, 1536, less than 24 hours after Anne's execution, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. On May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's death, they were married. 11 days. Let me be clear about what this timing means. Henry had been planning his marriage to Jane before Anne was even dead. He'd been courting Jane while Anne was in the Tower. He'd been discussing wedding plans while his wife was being tried on fabricated charges. The execution wasn't the sad end to a tragic situation. It was an inconvenient delay to Henry's next marriage. Have you ever felt discarded by someone, like you were just replaced, as if what you shared meant nothing? Now imagine that on a national scale. Imagine being erased so completely that your replacement is being celebrated before your body is even cold. That's what Henry did to Anne, and it shows us something crucial about his character at this point in his life. He'd completely lost the ability to see other people as human. They were just objects, tools, obstacles. When they served his purposes, he elevated them. When they didn't, he discarded them. And if they were in the way, he killed them. The English public was shocked by the speed of Henry's remarriage. Even people who'd believed Anne was guilty were uncomfortable with how quickly Henry moved on. According to various contemporary accounts, there was widespread gossip that Henry had been planning this all along, that he'd manufactured the charges to get rid of Anne, which of course he had. We know this now. Historians have thoroughly debunked the charges against Anne. The timeline doesn't work. The evidence doesn't exist. The charges were fabricated by Thomas Cromwell at Henry's behest. Anne Boleyn was innocent. She was murdered by her husband because he wanted a different wife. Let that sink in. A woman went from nobody to queen to executed criminal in less than a decade because a man with absolute power wanted her and then stopped wanting her. Anne's story should have ended there. Tragic footnote in history. The queen who lost her head. But it didn't end there, because Anne left behind a daughter, a little girl named Elizabeth who was just 2.5 years old when her mother died. Elizabeth who was declared illegitimate. Elizabeth who lost her title. Elizabeth who spent her childhood knowing her father had killed her mother, and that little girl would grow up to become the greatest monarch England ever had. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again, because what happened immediately after Anne's death? What were the consequences of this judicial murder? How did England react? How did the people who'd helped destroy Anne fare? And what about Henry? Did he ever regret what he'd done? The aftermath of Anne's execution is a story of karma, consequences, and the long shadow cast by injustice. It's time to see what happened next. They say what goes around comes around. In Henry VIII's court, it came around with a vengeance. Less than 2 weeks after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour in a quiet ceremony at York Place. No grand celebration, no public festivities. Even Henry seemed to understand that partying immediately after executing his wife was bad optics. Jane was everything Anne wasn't, physically and temperamentally. Fair where Anne was dark, submissive where Anne was assertive, traditional where Anne was progressive, and Henry, in his infinite narcissism, convinced himself that this time, finally, he'd found the perfect wife. But here's where the universe decided to have its say. Jane did get pregnant. Quickly, actually. She conceived within months of marriage. And in October 1537, after a long and difficult labour, Jane gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Edward. The male heir Henry had destroyed 2 marriages, countless lives, and England's relationship with Rome to obtain. According to contemporary accounts, Henry wept with joy when Edward was born. Finally, after 28 years of marriage to 2 different women, after the deaths of so many infants, after all the drama and trauma, he had a legitimate male heir. Henry threw celebrations. He ordered Te Deum sung in churches across England. He paraded the baby through court. This was his victory, his vindication, proof that God approved of his choices. The celebrations lasted about a week. Then Jane Seymour developed puerperal fever, a bacterial infection common in childbirth before modern medicine. According to the detailed account kept by Jane's own household, she was delirious with fever within days of giving birth. By October 23rd, less than 2 weeks after Edward's birth, Jane was dead. Some historians call this cosmic justice. Henry had executed Anne partly because she couldn't produce a surviving male heir. Jane produced his male heir and died days later, possibly from complications related to the birth itself. It's almost too perfect to be coincidence. And Henry. According to Chapuis's report, Henry was devastated. He genuinely mourned Jane, more than he'd mourned either of his previous wives. Why? Probably because Jane died having fulfilled her purpose. She gave him what he wanted, and then she had the good grace to die before disappointing him. In Henry's mind, she was perfect because she never got the chance to be human. That tells you everything about Henry's psychology. He couldn't love actual complex human beings. He could only love idealized versions that existed in his head. Once reality intruded, once his wives showed opinions or failed to produce sons or aged, or did any of the normal human things, he turned on them. But let's talk about the people who'd helped destroy Anne, because their stories are fascinating and often karmic. Thomas Cromwell, the man who'd orchestrated Anne's downfall, he lasted exactly 4 more years. In 1540, Cromwell convinced Henry to marry Anne of Cleves for political reasons, an alliance with German Protestant states. The marriage was a disaster. Henry found Anne physically unattractive and blamed Cromwell for pushing the match. Sound familiar? Henry's pattern was repeating itself, and just like with Anne Boleyn, when Henry wanted out of a situation, someone had to pay. On June 10th, 1540, Cromwell was arrested during a council meeting. The charges: treason and heresy. The same kinds of fabricated charges he'd used against Anne. According to historian Diarmaid MacCulloch's biography, Cromwell was taken to the Tower, tried, and executed on July 28, 1540. He was beheaded on Tower Hill, just like the men he'd condemned. In his final letter to Henry, Cromwell begged for mercy. He called himself the most woeful subject in the world. He probably knew in those final days exactly how Anne Boleyn had felt. The terror, the injustice, the realization that power meant nothing when the king turned against you. Cromwell's execution was botched. According to eyewitness accounts, the executioner was inexperienced and took multiple blows to sever his head. Cromwell died in agony. Some called it divine retribution for what he'd done to Anne. What about the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle who'd presided over her trial? He survived longer but ended up in the Tower too. In 1546, Norfolk was arrested on vague charges of treason. He was scheduled to be executed on January 28, 1547. But the night before his execution, Henry VIII died. The execution was cancelled. Norfolk spent the rest of Edward VI's reign in the Tower and was only released when Mary became queen, so he escaped execution by pure luck. Henry's death saved him, but he spent years in the same tower where he'd sent his niece to die. The same rooms, the same walls, the same fear. Jane Seymour's family, the Seymours, rose to power after Jane gave Henry his son. Her brother Edward Seymour became Lord Protector of England during Edward VI's minority. But the Seymours fell just as quickly as they'd risen. Edward Seymour was executed in 1552 on charges of treason. The family that had replaced the Boleyns suffered the same fate. Even Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, Anne's first love who'd been forced to vote for her execution, had a terrible end. Percy was sick during Anne's trial and collapsed afterward. He died just 6 months later, in June 1536, at age 35. Some said he died of a broken heart. More likely it was tuberculosis or some other illness. But the timing is haunting, and Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, the one who'd been Henry's mistress before Anne, she quietly married a soldier named William Stafford for love, moved to the countryside, and lived out her life away from court. She was the only Boleyn sibling to survive and die naturally. Sometimes the smartest move is to get as far away from power as possible. But what about Elizabeth, the little girl who lost her mother at age 2.5? Her story is both heartbreaking and ultimately triumphant. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne. She was removed from the line of succession. She lost her title of princess. She was moved from palace to palace, her household reduced, her status uncertain. According to later accounts from people who knew Elizabeth as a child, she was a serious, intelligent girl who rarely smiled. She wore simple clothes, often in black or white. Some historians think this was to avoid drawing attention or to subtly honour her mother's memory. She was cautious, observant, careful with her words. Can you imagine growing up knowing your father killed your mother, knowing you were declared illegitimate, knowing that at any moment you could be seen as a threat and eliminated? That was Elizabeth's childhood. Henry largely ignored Elizabeth. He married 3 more times after Jane Seymour's death. Anne of Cleves, annulled after 6 months. Catherine Howard, executed in 1542 on charges eerily similar to Anne Boleyn's, and Catherine Parr, who survived him. None of these stepmothers had much influence over Elizabeth's upbringing. But Elizabeth learned. She learned to keep her opinions to herself. She learned to navigate danger. She learned that showing emotion was weakness. She learned that power was fickle and love even more so. She learned that being a woman in a man's world meant playing by different rules. And most importantly, she learned from her mother's mistakes. Anne had been bold, outspoken, politically active. It had gotten her killed. Elizabeth would be cautious, calculated, impossible to pin down. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, Edward VI became king at age 9. He was sickly, dominated by regents, and died in 1553 at just 15 years old. Then Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, became queen. Mary, who'd watched her mother be discarded and humiliated. Mary, who saw Anne Boleyn as the woman who destroyed her family. Mary had every reason to hate Elizabeth, her half-sister, and the daughter of the concubine. Mary actually considered executing Elizabeth at one point. Elizabeth was implicated in plots against Mary, probably falsely, and was imprisoned in the Tower in 1554, the same tower where her mother had died. Elizabeth was 20 years old, terrified, convinced she'd be executed just like her mother. But Elizabeth survived through sheer political skill. She convinced Mary she was loyal. She converted back to Catholicism, at least outwardly. She bided her time. And when Mary died childless in 1558, Elizabeth became queen. She was 25 years old, and she would rule for 44 years. Elizabeth never married. When people asked why, she'd say she was married to England. But many historians believe Elizabeth's refusal to marry was directly connected to what happened to her mother. Marriage, in Elizabeth's experience, was dangerous. Husbands had power over wives. Henry had absolute power over Anne. Elizabeth decided no man would ever have that power over her. And under Elizabeth, England flourished. The Elizabethan era is called a golden age for a reason. Shakespeare wrote his plays during Elizabeth's reign. England defeated the Spanish Armada. English explorers circumnavigated the globe. The Protestant Church was firmly established. English culture, literature, and influence expanded globally. Everything Henry had wanted, stability, prosperity, global power, a strong succession, was delivered not by the son he'd destroyed lives to obtain, but by the daughter of the woman he'd murdered. Edward VI, the precious male heir. He died at 15, no children, no legacy, just a sickly boy who barely ruled. Elizabeth III. She reigned until 1603, dying at 69. She transformed England from a minor European power into a force that would eventually build the largest empire in history. The British Empire, which would go on to shape the modern world, was built on foundations laid during Elizabeth's reign. So in the end, Anne Boleyn won. Not in her lifetime. She died terrified and alone on a scaffold. But through her daughter, through Elizabeth's reign, through the fact that history remembers Anne not as the adulteress Henry tried to paint her as, but as a woman who was murdered by a tyrant. History has been kind to Anne in a way her own era wasn't. Modern historians almost universally agree she was innocent. She's been the subject of countless books, films, TV shows. People are fascinated by her story, her rise, her fall, her intelligence, her tragedy. And Henry? He's remembered as a tyrant, a wife killer, A man who let ego and lust destroy lives and reshape nations. Yes, he broke England from Rome and inadvertently created the conditions for England's later power. But that's almost accidental. He wasn't trying to reform Christianity. He was trying to get a divorce. There's a portrait of Anne Boleyn in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Well, probably. Remember, we're not certain which portraits are actually her, but there's one that's traditionally identified as Anne, showing a young woman with dark eyes and a hint of a smile. People still visit that portrait. They still lay flowers at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne is buried. They still tell her story. In 1876, during renovations to the chapel, Anne's remains were found and identified. She was reburied properly, and a marker was finally placed. After 340 years, she finally got a proper grave marker with her name on it. The inscription reads, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, beheaded in the Tower of London, 19th May 1536. Short, factual. But underneath those words is a story about power, obsession, injustice, and ultimately a strange kind of victory. Because Anne's legacy lived on. Her daughter became one of the greatest monarchs in history. The religious reformation she supported, however imperfectly, fundamentally changed Christianity. The boldness she showed, the refusal to be just a mistress, the insistence on being taken seriously as an intellectual equal, these were radical for her time. Was Anne perfect? No. She could be sharp-tongued, vengeful to enemies, politically ruthless. She wasn't a saint. She was human, ambitious, intelligent, flawed, complex, everything humans are. But she didn't deserve what happened to her. Nobody deserves to be murdered on fabricated charges because someone with power decided they were inconvenient. And that's the real lesson of Anne Boleyn's story. It's not just historical drama. It's a warning about what happens when power is absolute and unchecked. When someone can rewrite laws, manipulate courts, and murder with impunity. When being innocent doesn't matter if the powerful want you gone. We've seen this pattern repeat throughout history. Political purges, show trials, character assassinations. People destroyed not for what they did, but because they stood in the way of someone's ambitions. Anne Boleyn's story is 500 years old, but it's still relevant, still resonant, still important. Because as long as power exists, as long as humans are capable of jealousy and cruelty and self-interest, stories like Anne's will keep happening. The question is, what do we learn from them? Do we recognize the patterns? Do we call out injustice when we see it? Do we remember that behind every historical tragedy are real people who loved, feared, hoped, and suffered? I'd like to think that by telling Anne's story, all of it, the complexity and nuance and tragedy, we honour not just her memory, but all the people throughout history who've been erased, silenced, or destroyed by those with power. So here's to Anne Boleyn, social climber, queen, mother, victim, survivor through legacy, a woman who changed the world, lost her head and won anyway. What comes next is where we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the long-term impact of Henry and Anne's story, how their relationship literally shaped centuries of history, including American history, since the United States wouldn't exist as it does without the English Reformation. We're going to trace the threads from Anne's execution in 1536 all the way to the present day. Because this story didn't end on Tower Green, it's still echoing through history. Let me show you how. Want to hear something wild? You're probably Protestant because of Anne Boleyn. Or at least, if you're American, the religious and cultural framework you live in exists partly because a king in the 1530s couldn't control his obsession with a woman who said no. Let me show you how one woman's execution created ripples that are still shaping the world 5 centuries later. When Henry VIII broke England away from the Catholic Church to marry Anne, he thought he was just solving a personal problem. Get the annulment Rome won't give me. Marry the woman I want. Produce a male heir. Simple. Except nothing about ripping apart 1,000-year-old religious structures is simple. And the consequences of that break would reshape not just England, but eventually the entire world. Here's the domino effect. England becomes Protestant. Protestant England competes with Catholic Spain and France. That rivalry drives English exploration and colonization. English Protestantism spreads to North America. American religious identity, with its emphasis on individual Bible reading, its distrust of centralized religious authority, its separation of church and state, all of that traces back in part to Henry's break with Rome. According to historian Diarmaid MacCulloch in his book The Reformation, A History, the English Reformation was unique because it started from the top down, from the king's personal desires, rather than from theological reform like Martin Luther's Reformation in Germany. MacCulloch writes, Henry VIII created a reformation by accident, driven not by religious conviction, but by dynastic desperation and sexual obsession. But accidental or not, it happened, and once it started, it couldn't be stopped. The ideas Anne supported, vernacular Bibles, direct access to scripture, reduced power of the clergy, these weren't just Henry's ideas. Anne genuinely believed in reform. She protected Protestant preachers. She gave Henry a copy of Tyndale's English Bible. She pushed theological debates at court. Was Anne a true believer or a political operator? Probably both. But her influence on Henry's religious policy was real. Historian Eric Ives argues in his biography that without Anne's encouragement, Henry might have broken with Rome but kept England more Catholic in practice. Anne pushed him toward actual Protestant reform. And here's where it gets interesting. Protestant England became the foundation for the British Empire. Now, I'm not saying the British Empire was good. We need to be clear about colonialism's horrific impacts. But I am saying that Protestant England's global expansion shaped the modern world in ways we're still living with. Think about language. English is now the global lingua franca. Why? Partly because the British Empire spread it across the globe, and that empire was built during Elizabeth I's reign and expanded in the centuries after. If Henry had stayed Catholic, if Anne had never pushed reforms, would English have become the global language? Maybe not. Think about law. The common law system used in the US, Canada, Australia, India, and dozens of other countries. That's English common law spread by the British Empire. The legal principles you deal with today, the way courts work, the concept of precedent, these trace back to English legal traditions that were solidified during and after the Tudor period. Think about political philosophy, the ideas of limited government, individual rights, representative democracy. Many of these were refined in Protestant England and later exported to its colonies. The American Revolution happened because American colonists believed they had rights as Englishmen. The philosophical framework for American independence came from English Enlightenment thinkers working within a Protestant context. I'm not saying Anne Boleyn caused all of this. That would be absurd. But she was a crucial link in the chain. Without Henry's obsession with Anne, no English Reformation in the 1530s. Without the Reformation, no Elizabeth I, who was only queen because she was Henry and Anne's daughter. Without Elizabeth, no defeat of the Spanish Armada, no foundation for British naval power, no eventual British Empire. It's the butterfly effect on a massive scale. One woman, one relationship, one execution, and the entire trajectory of Western history shifts. Let's talk about Elizabeth III specifically, because Anne's most important legacy was her daughter. Elizabeth reigned from 1558 to 1603, 44 years of relative peace and prosperity that historians call the Elizabethan era or the English Golden Age. Under Elizabeth, England went from a minor European power to a major player on the world stage. According to historian David Starkey in Elizabeth: The Struggle for the Throne, Elizabeth's reign saw English literature flourish. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser all wrote during this period. English exploration expanded. Drake, Raleigh, Frobisher all sailed under Elizabeth's flag. English military power grew. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a turning point that established England as a naval power, and Elizabeth did all this as an unmarried woman in an era that believed women were inherently inferior and needed male guidance. She ruled alone. She made decisions alone. She outsmarted male monarchs who underestimated her. She turned her gender from a weakness into a strategic advantage. Would Elizabeth have been this way without her mother's story? We can't know for sure. But historian Alison Weir argues in The Life of Elizabeth I that Elizabeth's political style, cautious, calculating, refusing to be controlled by any man, was directly influenced by watching what happened to both her mother and her father's other wives. Elizabeth learned that marriage for a queen meant subordination, so she chose never to marry. In her famous speech to Parliament in 1559, Elizabeth said, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." That's not just rhetoric. That's Elizabeth deliberately positioning herself as married to her realm, so no actual husband could claim power over her. She'd seen what happened when queens had husbands. Anne had Henry, Catherine Howard had Henry, Catherine of Aragon had Henry. All were either discarded or executed. Elizabeth chose a different path, and that path worked. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, England was unrecognisable from the England of 1558. Wealthier, more stable, more Protestant, more powerful, more culturally influential. Here's a crazy statistic. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, England's annual crown revenue was about $200,000. By 1603, it had increased to over $300,000, a 50% increase. According to economic historian Joan Thirsk in Economic Policy and Projects, Elizabeth's reign saw sustained economic growth, expansion of trade, development of new industries. The foundation for England's later prosperity was laid during Anne Boleyn's daughter's reign. But Anne's legacy isn't just political and economic, it's cultural. Anne Boleyn has become a symbol, a feminist icon in some interpretations, a cautionary tale in others, a tragic heroine, a manipulative seductress. Depending on who's telling the story, Anne is everything from victim to villain, and that's partly Anne's own doing. She was complex. She was ambitious, unforgivably ambitious for a woman of her era. She was intelligent, dangerously intelligent. She wouldn't stay in the box society built for women, and for that, she was destroyed. But she's also been reclaimed. In the 20th and 21st centuries especially, historians and writers have rehabilitated Anne's reputation. Philippa Gregory's novels, while fictionalized, introduced millions of readers to Anne's story. Natalie Dormer's portrayal in The Tudors showed Anne as intelligent and tragic. Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, while focused on Thomas Cromwell, still presented Anne as a victim of political machination. These cultural representations matter because they shape how we understand power, gender, and justice. Anne's story has become shorthand for woman destroyed by patriarchal system. It's taught in gender studies courses. It's analysed in feminist scholarship. It's referenced in discussions about victim blaming and character assassination. According to cultural historian Sarah Gristwood in Game of Queens, Anne Boleyn has appeared in over 100 films, TV shows, novels, and plays. She's one of the most portrayed women in historical fiction. Why? Because her story hits something universal: the danger of wanting too much, the price of ambition, the vulnerability of being female in a male-dominated world, the horror of being destroyed by someone who claimed to love you. And let's talk about that last point because it's crucial. Henry and Anne's story is, at its core, about intimate partner violence taken to an extreme. Henry didn't just leave Anne or divorce her. He destroyed her reputation and then killed her. He used state power to commit what was essentially domestic violence on a national scale. We see this pattern today, don't we? Abusive partners who can't let go, who destroy their partner's credibility, who isolate them from support systems, who use whatever power they have, financial, social, legal, to control and ultimately harm. Henry's execution of Anne is the ultimate version of, if I can't have you, no one can. Modern psychologists analysing Henry's behaviour often diagnose him with narcissistic personality disorder. According to forensic psychiatrist Kira Kramer, writing in Blood Will Tell, a medical explanation for the tyranny of Henry VIII, Henry displayed classic narcissistic traits: grandiosity, lack of empathy, need for excessive admiration, sense of entitlement, interpersonal exploitation. And narcissists, when rejected or disappointed, can become vindictive and cruel. That's the Henry we see in 1536. Anne had disappointed him, failed to produce a son, challenged him publicly, lost her novelty, and rather than simply ending the relationship, Henry needed to destroy her completely. To rewrite history so it was her fault, not his. To make himself the victim of a wicked woman rather than the perpetrator of judicial murder. Sound familiar? We see this in modern cancel culture, in political smear campaigns, in any situation where someone with power needs to justify their cruelty. Reframe the narrative. Make the victim the villain. Use whatever platform or power you have to control the story. Anne's story is a warning about what happens when we allow that kind of narrative manipulation, when we believe powerful people's accusations without evidence, when we let fear or bias or sensationalism override our critical thinking. But it's also a story about resilience of legacy. Henry tried to erase Anne. He had her executed, buried in an unmarked grave, her name removed from records where possible. He moved on to Jane immediately as if Anne had never existed. He wanted her forgotten. But here we are nearly 500 years later talking about Anne Boleyn. Her story has endured, her name is remembered, her daughter's reign is celebrated, and Henry, he's remembered primarily as a tyrant who married 6 times and killed 2 of his wives. Anne won the long game, not through survival, but through memory. Through the fact that every generation rediscovers her story and finds something relevant in it. Through her daughter's incredible reign. Through the Protestant Reformation she helped enable. Through the cultural legacy she left behind. There's something profound about that. About how the people in power can win in the moment but lose in history. About how victims can be vindicated not by justice in their lifetime, but by how later generations understand their stories. And this brings us to the question, what do we learn from all this? What does Henry and Anne's story teach us about ourselves, our world, our relationships, our power structures? Because this isn't just history. This is a mirror. When we look at Henry VIII's court, we're looking at human nature stripped of modern pretense. We're seeing what people do when they have power and no real accountability. We're seeing how love can curdle into obsession, how ambition can become dangerous, how justice can be corrupted, how the vulnerable are sacrificed to protect the powerful. These patterns haven't changed. They've just taken new forms. So let's dig into the lessons. Let's extract the wisdom from this tragedy. Let's figure out what Henry and Anne's story is really trying to tell us about power, love, obsession, gender, and the human condition. All right, we've spent over 2 hours together walking through this story. From the first moment Henry saw Anne to the final blow of the executioner's sword. From the passionate love letters to the cold execution scaffold. From the break with Rome to Elizabeth's golden age. Now it's time to ask, so what? What do we do with this story? What does it teach us? I think there are 5 massive lessons here. 5 truths about human nature that were true in 1536 and are still true today. Let's walk through them. Henry VIII convinced himself he was in love with Anne Boleyn. He wrote those 17 desperate letters. He waited 7 years. He destroyed his kingdom's relationship with Rome. He executed friends. All for love, right? Except it wasn't love. It was obsession. And there's a crucial difference. Love wants the other person's happiness, even if it's not with you. Obsession wants possession. Love accepts the other person as a complex, flawed human. Obsession creates an idealized fantasy that real humans can never live up to. Love respects boundaries. Obsession bulldozes them. Henry's love for Anne was really about winning, about conquering, about proving to himself that he could get what he wanted. The moment Anne stopped being a prize to be won and became a real person with opinions and failures and complexity, Henry's love evaporated. And we see this today constantly. People who say I love you but mean I want you. People who pursue you relentlessly when you're unavailable but lose interest once you commit. People who build you up as perfect and then destroy you for being human. People who confuse intensity with intimacy. If you've ever been in a relationship where someone was obsessed with the idea of you but didn't actually see the real you, you understand what Anne experienced. That's not love, that's possession, and it's dangerous. Henry VIII could do whatever he wanted. Break with Rome, done. Execute his friends, done. Frame his wife for treason and have her killed, done. There was no one to stop him. No checks on his power, no accountability, and absolute power corrupted him absolutely. The Henry of 1509, young, generous, beloved, was a different person from the Henry of 1536. Paranoid, cruel, tyrannical. What changed? He realized he could get away with anything. Once you cross that line, once you execute Thomas More and get away with it, once you dissolve monasteries and face no consequences, what's to stop you from doing worse? This lesson is crucial for modern democracies. The entire point of checks and balances, separation of powers, rule of law, free press. All of these exist because we've learned that concentrating power in one person or one institution inevitably leads to abuse. Look at any modern dictatorship. Look at how leaders who start with good intentions gradually become tyrants once they eliminate opposition and accountability. It's the Henry VIII pattern repeating itself. But it's not just about political power. This applies to any power imbalance. Corporate CEOs with no oversight. Religious leaders with unquestioned authority. Parents who face no accountability for how they treat their children. Teachers who abuse power over students. Police with no oversight. Anyone with power over others needs accountability, or that power will eventually be abused. This is a hard truth, but we need to say it. Anne Boleyn was destroyed by the man who claimed to love her. Not by an enemy, not by a stranger, by her husband. The man who'd written her love letters, who'd promised to protect her, who'd put a crown on her head. And statistically, this pattern holds. According to the CDC, intimate partner violence affects millions of people each year, and women are disproportionately affected. The most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries to leave. Because abuse is about control, and abusers can't stand losing control. Henry couldn't control Anne anymore. She'd failed him. She'd disappointed him. She'd lost her usefulness. And rather than just divorce her, he needed to destroy her completely. Because narcissists don't just move on. They need to win. They need to be the victim. They need their partners to be the villain. We see this in modern domestic violence cases, in celebrity breakups where one partner wages a media war against the other, in custody battles where one parent tries to destroy the other's reputation. The pattern is the same. If I can't control you, I'll destroy you. Anne's story teaches us to recognize these patterns, to see the warning signs, to understand that someone who loves you so much they can't live without you might actually be someone who sees you as an object they possess, not a person they respect. Thomas Cromwell didn't have evidence that Anne committed adultery, so he manufactured it. He took normal interactions and twisted them. He tortured one man into confessing. He built a narrative so scandalous, including the incest charge, that people's disgust overrode their critical thinking. This is the playbook for destroying someone. Make the accusation horrifying enough that people don't ask for proof. Make it about moral outrage rather than facts. Make the accused seem so monstrous that defending them becomes social suicide. We see this constantly in modern life. Political smear campaigns, cancel culture, social media pile-ons. Someone gets accused of something terrible. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But the accusation spreads faster than any correction. The person's reputation is destroyed before they can defend themselves. And even if they're later cleared, the stain remains. Anne Boleyn was innocent. Every serious historian agrees. But it didn't matter. The charges were so shocking that people believed them. And even today, some people wonder if maybe there was something to it. That's how effective character assassination is. The doubt lingers even when the accusations are proven false. The lesson? We need to demand evidence. We need to resist mob mentality. We need to remember that accusations aren't proof. And we need to be deeply suspicious when powerful people make shocking claims about those who threaten them. Henry won. Let's be clear about that. He got rid of Anne. He married Jane. He got his son. He died in his bed as King of England. By any immediate measure, Henry won completely. But look at how history remembers him. Henry VIII is a cautionary tale, a joke. The king who had 6 wives and killed 2 of them. He's famous for his failures and his cruelty, not his successes. Anne lost. She was executed at 33. She died terrified and alone. Her reputation was destroyed. Her daughter was declared illegitimate. By any immediate measure, Anne lost completely. But look at how history remembers her. Anne is tragic, fascinating, sympathetic, a woman ahead of her time, a victim of injustice, and her legacy, through Elizabeth, shaped the world. This teaches us something profound. Winning the moment doesn't mean winning the long game. What matters isn't whether you succeed in the immediate sense, but what you leave behind, how you're remembered, what values you stood for, what you contributed to the world. Think about your own life. Are you making choices that might win today but lose long term? Are you prioritizing immediate victory over lasting legacy? Are you treating people in ways you'd be ashamed to have remembered? Henry chose immediate gratification over long-term consequence. He chose power over principle. He chose ego over empathy. And history has judged him harshly for it. Anne, whatever her flaws and ambitions, was destroyed unjustly. She defended herself with dignity. She died protecting her daughter, and history has vindicated her. So what do we do with all this? How do we apply these lessons? First, in your relationships, recognize the difference between love and obsession. Real love is patient, kind, respectful. It doesn't demand, doesn't control, doesn't destroy. If someone's love for you feels more like ownership, run. If someone can't handle your complexity, your humanity, your autonomy, they don't actually love you. They love an idea of you. And that gap between idea and reality is where danger lives. Second, in your relationship with power, be deeply skeptical of concentrated authority. Question leaders who face no accountability. Support systems of checks and balances. Use whatever power you have responsibly, knowing that how you treat the vulnerable defines you. And if you see power being abused, speak up. Don't be the nobles who voted to convict Anne even though they knew she was innocent. Have the courage to stand for truth even when it's costly. Third, in how you treat others, resist the urge to destroy people's reputations, even if someone has wronged you, even if you're angry, even if you have the power to hurt them. Because character assassination might feel satisfying in the moment, but it says more about you than about them. Be the person who demands evidence, who questions narratives, who gives people the benefit of the doubt. Fourth, in how you think about justice, understand that legal systems can be corrupted, that trials can be theatre, that confessions can be coerced, that powerful people can manufacture guilt. So when someone is accused, especially by someone more powerful, ask, what's the evidence? Who benefits from this accusation? What's the full story? Anne's trial should have taught us to be skeptical of convictions that happen too quickly, rely on coerced testimony, and serve the interests of the powerful. And finally, in how you think about legacy, play the long game. Don't sacrifice your integrity for immediate victory. Don't become someone you'd be ashamed to have remembered. Think about what you're building beyond yourself. Think about what you're leaving behind. Because here's the beautiful, terrible irony of Henry and Anne's story. Henry destroyed England's relationship with Rome to marry Anne and produce a male heir. That male heir, Edward VI, died at 15 without children. Henry's carefully constructed dynasty collapsed within a generation. But Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, ruled for 44 years. She never married, she never had children. But she created a legacy that lasted centuries. The Elizabethan era shaped English culture, politics, and power in ways we're still living with. Henry got his son and lost. Anne lost everything and won. If that's not a lesson about legacy over immediate victory, I don't know what is. We're at the end of our journey together now. 2.5 hours walking through one of history's most dramatic stories. From love to obsession. From courtship to coronation, from triumph to tragedy, from execution to legacy. I hope you've seen not just a historical drama, but a mirror, a reflection of patterns that still exist today, power dynamics that still harm people, love that still curdles into obsession, justice that can still be corrupted, but also, and this is crucial, hope that legacy matters, that truth eventually emerges, that the arc of history, as Dr. King said, bends toward justice. It just sometimes takes centuries. Anne Boleyn waited nearly 500 years for history to vindicate her. That's a long time, but vindication came. The truth came out. Her legacy endured. If you're facing injustice right now, if you're being misunderstood or mischaracterized, if powerful people are trying to control your narrative, hold on to that. The truth might not win today. But in the long run, in the accounting that really matters, truth tends to surface. And if you're in a position of power right now, remember Henry's lesson. How you use that power will define your legacy. You can be remembered as the tyrant who destroyed lives for selfish reasons, or as someone who wielded power with wisdom and compassion. That choice is yours. Before we finish, I want to ask you something. What's the biggest lesson you're taking from Henry and Anne's story? Is it about relationships, about power, about ambition, about justice? Drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear what resonated with you. And if you've made it this far, 2.5 hours, thank you. Seriously. Thank you for caring about history, for being willing to sit with a complex, tragic story, for seeing these people not as names in a textbook, but as real humans who loved and feared and hoped and suffered. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button. I've got more historical stories coming. Stories of power, love, betrayal, triumph, tragedy. Stories that teach us about ourselves. And hit the like button if you found this valuable. It really helps the algorithm show this to other history nerds like us. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding the patterns that shape our present and our future. It's about learning from others' mistakes so we don't repeat them. It's about seeing ourselves in people who lived centuries ago and realizing that human nature, for better and worse, doesn't change that much. Anne Boleyn's story ended on a scaffold in 1536, but her legacy, that's still being written through Elizabeth, through the Reformation, through every person who hears her story and learns something about power, justice, love, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. Sleep well tonight. Dream of better futures built on the lessons of the past. And remember, no matter how powerful your enemies, no matter how dark your circumstances, your story isn't over until it's over. And even then, legacy endures. Good night, everyone, until our next journey through history.